Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to HP Story. In today's episode, we explore: what if Platform 9 and 3/4 wards detected Harry's starvation and automatically alerted DMLE to Dumbledore's neglect conspiracy? Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Threshold remembers the Dursleys dropped him at King's Cross with his trolley, his owl, and 4 words. Don't come back, freak. Uncle Vernon didn't even park the car properly. He pulled up on the yellow lines outside the station entrance, popped the boot from the driver's seat so Harry had to drag his own trunk out onto the pavement, and was pulling back into traffic before the cage with Hedwig inside had fully cleared the bumper. Harry stood on the pavement with the noise of London morning traffic washing over him and watched the tail lights of the Dursleys' car disappear around the corner. He didn't feel much about it. That was the thing about the Dursleys. 10 years of them had burned away most of the feelings Harry might have had in response to their particular brand of cruelty. What was left was something cleaner and colder. Not hatred exactly. More like the way you feel about a problem you've finally stopped expecting to solve itself. He turned and looked at the station. King's Cross was enormous and indifferent and full of people with places to be, which made it, in Harry's estimation, significantly better than Privet Drive already. He maneuvered the trolley through the automatic doors, squinting at the boards, trying to look like he knew what he was doing. He had a ticket. He had Platform 9 and 3/4 written on a piece of paper in his pocket. He had absolutely no idea where Platform 9 and 3/4 was, because there was a Platform 9 and there was a Platform 10 and between them there was a solid brick wall. He had been standing and staring at that wall for about 4 minutes when he heard it. Can't shove, Fred, the trolley's going to. I know, watch the owl, Mom, the muggles are looking. He turned. A family was navigating the crowd with the kind of cheerful chaos that suggested they did everything at volume. A tall woman with red hair and kind eyes, twins who moved like they were sharing a private joke with the universe, a younger boy about Harry's age with more freckles than face, and a girl who looked like she was already tired of all of them. Every single one of them had red hair. Their trolleys were stacked with trunks and cages. One of the owls was particularly fat and offended-looking. The boy, his age, the freckled one, caught Harry staring and offered an uncomplicated shrug, the kind that said I know, we're a lot. The mother swept past the barrier between Platform 9 and Platform 10 like it wasn't there at all. Harry blinked. Then the twins went through. Then the girl. Then the freckled boy, who glanced back at Harry with something like an invitation in his expression before he disappeared through solid brick. Harry looked at the wall. Then he looked at his trolley. Hedwig made a sound that, in Harry's personal translation, meant well, go on then. He went through at a run, because he'd found that committing completely was the best approach to things that shouldn't work, and the wall dissolved around him like cold water, and then he was standing on the other side and the world was entirely different. He stopped breathing for a moment. The platform was real and not real at the same time, real in the way that this is solid ground under my feet is real, unreal in the way that none of this should exist is unreal. A scarlet steam engine sat breathing quietly at the platform's edge, brass fittings catching the light, the words Hogwarts Express picked out in gold along the side. Smoke curled lazily toward a ceiling that shouldn't have been there. Families in robes, actual robes, moved up and down the platform. Owls called. Somewhere a cat was voicing a formal complaint. The air smelled of coal smoke and something else, something older and stranger that Harry couldn't name but that felt, in some buried and inarticulate part of him, like home. He stood at the threshold where the barrier opened onto the platform and he breathed. And then the platform's magic breathed back. He didn't notice it at first. It felt like standing in a shaft of sunlight, a warmth that moved across him like a careful hand, like something paying attention. It lasted about 3 seconds. He assumed it was just the strangeness of the place, the way magic apparently just felt like something, and he pushed his trolley forward and started looking for a compartment. He did not know that in the wall behind him, carved into the ancient stone in sigils so old their original language had been dead for 4 centuries, a sequence of ward runes had just lit up for the first time in 11 years. He did not know that the light they produced was the color of alarm. He did not know that the wards were designed, by Rowena Ravenclaw herself, according to records that very few people had bothered to read, to scan every magical child who passed through them, checking for dark enchantments, compulsion curses, binding spells, and evidence of harm. He did not know that what they found in him had caused the wards to produce a result that none of the 3 Aurors stationed at platform 9 3/4 that morning had ever seen before. The result was a red pulse, a silent one, that traveled through the ward network like a ripple through still water, moving from platform 9 3/4 to the Ministry of Magic in 0.4 seconds. The result was also a piece of parchment. It appeared in the hand of Auror Kingsley Shacklebolt as he stood near the barrier, because he was the senior officer and the wards always delivered to seniority. He looked down at it. "Read it. Read it again." And then said very quietly, "Tonks." His partner materialized from somewhere in the crowd, currently wearing the face of an ordinary middle-aged woman, which she had clearly forgotten about because her hair had gone bubblegum pink at the ends in a way that didn't match the rest of her at all. She leaned over to read the parchment. "Oh," she said. And then, after a pause in which the full weight of the thing seemed to settle on her, "Oh no." Kingsley was already reaching for his communication mirror. Amelia Bones had been head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 3 years, and in that time she had developed a highly calibrated sense for when a morning was about to become something else entirely. It was a physical thing, like a shift in barometric pressure. She felt it now, sitting at her desk with her second cup of tea and a stack of interdepartmental memos, when her door flew open and her assistant, a young man named Perkins who was normally the least dramatic person in the ministry, came in looking like he'd seen a ghost. "Platform 9 3/4 wards, ma'am," he said. "They triggered. Priority 1. Amelia set down her tea with the deliberate care of someone who has learned not to knock things over when surprising news arrives. "Priority 1 hasn't triggered since 1979. I checked." Perkins put the parchment on her desk. "Shacklebolt's on scene." She read the parchment. The ward's report was precise, the way very old magic was always precise. No ambiguity, no approximation. Just a cool factual accounting that made the facts somehow worse. It listed everything. The malnutrition, chronic, years in duration, the kind that left markers in magical core development. Evidence of healed fractures in the right arm and 2 ribs, healed without magical assistance, suggesting the injuries had been sustained and recovered from in a non-magical environment with no treatment beyond time. Suppressed magical core development, artificially constrained, not by the child but around the child, suggesting sustained environmental hostility toward accidental magic. And at the bottom, almost as an afterthought in the ward's clinical language, the detail that made Amelia's jaw tighten until it ached: subject, Potter, Harry James. Age 11. Last guardian registered, Dumbledore, Albus Percival Wulfric Bryan. Placement authorized, November 1, 1981. She stood up. "Get me the head of Magical Child Welfare. Get me St. Mungo's on call. And get me Shacklebolt's location." She was already reaching for her outer robe. "Don't contact Dumbledore." Perkins blinked. "Ma'am? His name is on that report as the authorizing party for the placement." She pulled the robe on with sharp, efficient movements. "Until I know what that means, he is not informed. Are we clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Perkins?" She paused at the door. "If anyone from the headmaster's office contacts us asking about platform 9 3/4, and they might, the wards are monitored, they get nothing. Procedural response only. An investigation is underway, details forthcoming." She walked out. Harry had found a compartment, hauled his trunk up with considerable effort and the stubbornness of someone who'd been moving his own furniture since he could reach it, and settled Hedwig's cage in the overhead rack. He sat down by the window and watched the platform. The red-haired family from earlier moved up and down the platform twice before settling down to goodbyes. The mother, he could hear her voice even through the glass, warm and a little frantic in the way of someone running on love and logistics, was kissing her children on the cheek in a way that made something in Harry's chest do a complicated thing he chose not to examine. The freckled boy, Ron, he heard her call him, was the last to board. He lugged his trunk up the steps and disappeared into the train. Harry looked away. The compartment door slid open and Ron Weasley put his head in with the cheerful assumption of someone who had never been made to feel unwelcome in his life. "Everywhere else is full," he said. "Can I sit? You're the one from the barrier, right? You went through running." "Yeah," Harry said. "Figured committing to it was safer than stopping halfway." Ron grinned. "First time? Is it that obvious?" "Nah. Well, a bit." He dragged his trunk in and got it onto the rack with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this several times before. "Ron Weasley." "Harry Potter." The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence produced by someone trying very hard to not react to something. Harry had gotten used to identifying it. He watched Ron do the mental recalibration, the flicker in his eyes, the quick glance at Harry's forehead, the effort of deciding whether to say anything about it, and waited. "Right," Ron said finally. "So, you're that Harry Potter. Apparently. You didn't know. About magic, I mean. Before the letter? I knew things kept happening," Harry said. "I didn't know what it was called." Ron nodded slowly, processing this. Then he said, with the tone of someone who's decided that the most normal response to an abnormal situation is to just carry on. "Want half my sandwich? My mum packed about 16 of them." Harry hadn't eaten since yesterday. He'd had a glass of water this morning before the Dursleys woke up, and he'd known better than to take anything from the kitchen that would be noticed missing. He kept his expression neutral and said, "Sure." He ate carefully, the way you learn to eat when you'd grown up never quite sure when the next meal was coming, methodically, making it last, not because he wanted to but because his body had learned to. Ron didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything, which Harry appreciated. They were 20 minutes out of London when the compartment door opened again, and this time it was an Auror. Harry knew what an Auror was because he'd spent a week in Diagon Alley absorbing everything he could find in books, and he recognized the badge and the specific kind of watchful competence that the woman in the doorway carried. She had pink-tipped hair today. He could see that the tips were brighter than the rest, like she'd forgotten to finish a glamour, and she was looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite succeeding at hiding something else underneath. "Harry Potter?" she said. Harry looked at her. "Yes. I'm Auror Tonks, DMLE. There's someone who needs to speak with you." She hesitated, which was interesting. Aurors, in his limited experience of them, didn't normally hesitate. "It's important. You're not in trouble. This is..." Another pause. "Actually the opposite of that." Ron had gone very still. Harry looked at Auror Tonks for a moment. She wasn't lying. He'd learned to read the specific quality of lies, the way people's voices went a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed. She was telling the truth as she understood it. She was also worried, in the way that people were worried when something had gone wrong that they hadn't caused but felt responsible for anyway. He stood up. "All right," he said. "I'll wait here?" Ron offered, with the slightly bewildered air of someone whose morning had escalated faster than expected. Harry nodded and followed Tonks into the corridor. The train had a small compartment near the front that had been cleared, and Kingsley Shacklebolt was standing in it with his arms folded and the expression of a man performing calm as a professional obligation. He was tall and dark-skinned and had a voice, when he spoke, that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than normal conversation. "Sit down, Harry," he said, and his voice was so genuinely non-threatening that Harry, who had spent 11 years calibrating threat levels, sat without thinking about it. Tonks closed the door and stood against it. Kingsley crouched slightly so he wasn't looking down at Harry, which was either a trained technique or a genuine impulse toward respect, and Harry couldn't tell which but noted it either way. "I need to ask you some questions," Kingsley said. "And I want to be upfront with you, because I think you deserve that. The platform's wards triggered when you came through." Harry waited. "The wards check for Well, for a lot of things. Dark magic on children, mostly. Curses, compulsions. But they also check for evidence of harm. Physical harm. Kingsley paused, and something in his expression shifted. They flag your results as a Priority 1 alert, which means we had to pull you. Today. Before the train reached Hogwarts. Harry looked at his hands. They were thin. He'd always known they were thin, the way you know things about your own body that you've stopped seeing because they've always been true. His wrists were visible. They'd been visible for a while. Okay, he said. Tonks made a small sound behind him. He didn't turn around. I need to ask? Kingsley said in the careful way of someone carrying something heavy. About where you've been living. The Dursleys at Privet Drive? Number 4. Harry said. What was it like there? Harry considered this question. It was, in its own way, a very funny question, because no one had ever asked him before, and he had never had to find words for it. Fine, he said, which was what he always said, and then something, the words results on a piece of parchment somewhere, probably, or the way Kingsley was looking at him like the answer actually mattered, made him stop. He tried again. They didn't want me there, he said. Uncle Vernon made that pretty clear from the start. I slept in a cupboard until I was 10. They gave me Dudley's second bedroom when the Hogwarts letters started coming because I think it scared them. I didn't get much to eat. He kept his voice even. I wasn't allowed to ask questions or do better than Dudley in school, and when things happened, the magic stuff, I'd get locked in for a week or so after. He paused. It was fine. I managed. The compartment was very quiet. Kingsley nodded slowly, like he was cataloging every word. You slept in the cupboard under the stairs? Until I was 10, yeah? Tonks, behind him, said something very quietly and then stopped herself. Harry, Kingsley said, I want you to know that what you've just described is not. He seemed to choose his words with unusual care. That is not a normal childhood. What was done to you is not your fault, and it is not legal. The wards flagged it because it is the kind of harm the wards exist to flag. Harry looked at him. We're taking you to St. Mungo's, Kingsley said. For a medical evaluation. It won't hurt, and it won't take long. After that, the head of the DMLE wants to speak with you. And then, for the first time, something uncertain crossed Kingsley's face. We'll figure out the rest. What about Hogwarts? Harry asked. You'll still go. That's not in question. Kingsley said it with the firmness of someone who'd anticipated the concern. Hogwarts is not negotiable. You have my word. Harry thought about this. He thought about the sorting, the castle he'd read about in Hogwarts, a history, the magic that was apparently waiting inside him like something that had been coiled up too long. He thought about the Dursleys, who were probably sitting down to a full English breakfast right now, entirely certain that they'd seen the last of him. Okay, he said for the second time. But I want to tell Ron. The kid in my compartment. He'll wonder where I went. Kingsley nodded. Tonks will pass him a message. I'd rather do it myself, Harry said, and the way he said it was not rude exactly, but it was not a request either. It was the voice of someone who had learned to state what he needed because no one was going to anticipate it. Another pause. Then Kingsley said, All right. Ron Weasley took the news with an expression that cycled through several stages in rapid succession: confusion, alarm, something deeply sympathetic that he clearly didn't know how to express, and then a sort of determined steadiness that, Harry would come to understand, was very Ron. That sounds serious, Ron said. Apparently. Harry agreed. Will you be all right? Harry looked at him. The question landed oddly, not because it was unwelcome but because he genuinely didn't know the last time someone had asked it. Yeah, he said. I'll see you at school. Gryffindor, Ron said with the confidence of family tradition. You'd better be in Gryffindor. I'll do my best. He was halfway out the door when Ron said quickly, like he'd been building up to it. The thing under the stairs. That's not right, mate. Harry stopped. He didn't turn around, because he wasn't ready to turn around, but he heard it, the absolute simplicity of it. Not a complicated statement. Not hedged or managed. Just, that's not right. No, Harry agreed quietly. It wasn't. And then he followed Tonks down the corridor and off the train. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries was in the middle of London and disguised as a closed department store, which Harry thought was either very clever or very strange and was probably both. The spell-damage ward was on the 4th floor, but they weren't going there. They were going to something called the examination suite on the 2nd floor, where a healer named Pomfrey adjacent. Her actual name was Healer Cavendish, but she had the same crisp efficient energy, and he mentally filed her that way, was waiting with a diagnostic wand and the professional neutrality of someone who had seen everything. The diagnostic wand moved over Harry like a lighthouse beam, slow and thorough, and produced a scroll of parchment about 2 feet long. Healer Cavendish read it. The professional neutrality developed a fault line. Amelia Bones arrived while the healer was on her 3rd read. She was not what Harry had expected. He had vaguely pictured something in the Dursley mold of authority, the kind that asserted itself through volume and displeasure. Instead, he saw a compact woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked dark hair, a monocle, and the kind of face that looked like it had made 1,000 hard decisions and was currently making another one. She read the scroll over the healer's shoulder. When she looked up at Harry, something moved across her face that he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pity. He would have recognized pity and hated it. It was something more like the expression of a person who has found the evidence for something they were hoping wasn't true. "I'm Amelia Bones," she said. She sat down across from him without ceremony, which he respected. "I run the DMLE. "I know," Harry said. "I read about it." Something in her expression shifted slightly, a reassessment. "Of course you did." She folded her hands. "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you've had enough of the alternative. The wards found things this morning that constitute multiple violations of the Magical Child Welfare Act of 1943. What the diagnostics can just confirmed is significantly worse than even what the wards indicated." Harry waited. He was good at waiting. 10 years of being told to wait, and be quiet, and not draw attention had at least given him that. "Chronic malnutrition," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that you made it steady on purpose. "2 improperly healed fractures. Vitamin deficiency consistent with years of inadequate nutrition. And your magical core," she glanced at the healer, who gave a brief nod, "shows signs of external suppression. Not a natural block. Something in your environment was actively hostile to your magic expressing itself." "The cupboard," Harry said. Amelia Bones looked at him steadily. "Tell me about the cupboard." So he did. He did it the way he told Kingsley, flat and factual, because the facts were enough without any editorial, and because he'd had a long time to practice not sounding like he needed anything from the telling of it. The cupboard. The locks on the outside. The pet flap for food when he'd been particularly out of favor. The way Dudley's friends used to kick the door. The way Harry had learned to sleep through it. Amelia Bones was utterly still throughout. When he finished, she said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." She leaned forward slightly. "Did anyone from the wizarding world ever visit? Check on you? Send letters, anything?" "No," Harry said. "You're the first magical people I've spoken to since, well." He thought about it. "Ever. Hagrid came to get me for Diagon Alley, but that was a month ago." She wrote something on a small notepad. Harry caught 2 words, Dumbledore and accountability. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said. "Yes," she said immediately, which surprised him. "The placement, my placement at the Dursleys. It said on the ward's report." He was guessing about the specifics, but her expression confirmed he was right. "It said it was authorized by Dumbledore." "It did," she said. "Was it legal? Him doing that? Without anyone checking?" Amelia Bones was quiet for a long moment. "That," she said, Is exactly the question we're going to be answering in the coming weeks. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has just revised their initial assessment upward. You're not what I expected, Harry. What did you expect? Honestly? A traumatized child who wouldn't know the right questions to ask. Harry considered this. I'm probably both, he said. But I've had a long time to think about what wasn't right. I just didn't have the vocabulary for the magical parts until last month. She almost smiled. It was a controlled thing, the smile, like she kept it rationed. Fair enough. She stood. We need to talk about next steps. Protective custody, which means you will not be returned to Privet Drive under any circumstances. Guardianship arrangements, which will require a hearing. And your start at Hogwarts, which will be delayed by a few days at most. She said this last part firmly, watching his face. A few days. Not weeks. What about Dumbledore? Harry asked. He's the headmaster. Yes, she said. He is. She said it the way you said something that contained a great deal more than the words themselves. That is going to be a complicated conversation. Will you tell me how it goes? She stopped, looked at him again. He met her gaze directly, which seemed to register. Yes, she said. I'll tell you how it goes. They gave him a room at the Ministry's secure housing wing, not a cell. He checked immediately, and the door opened from the inside, which mattered in a way he couldn't entirely explain. It was a small room with a real bed and a window and an attached bathroom, and when someone brought dinner it was a full plate with seconds offered without him having to ask, and he sat on the edge of the bed after he'd eaten and put his hand flat on the mattress and pressed down on the realness of it. Hedwig was on a perch in the corner, cleaning her feathers with the lofty air of an owl who had been through considerable inconvenience today and had opinions about it. She paused and looked at him. I know, he said. She went back to her feathers. He lay back and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the wards, ancient things, Ravenclaw's things, humming with old purpose, that had looked at him and said this is wrong, this should not have been. Not to him. He hadn't heard them. But they had said it. They had been saying it all along, built to say it, and no one had been listening. They had been listening today. He wasn't sure, yet, what to do with that. Gratitude felt too large. Relief felt too simple. What he felt was something more precise. The specific sensation of a door you've been pushing against for your entire life finally, unexpectedly, pushing back. Down the hall, he could hear voices. Amelia Bones and Kingsley Shacklebolt, talking in the low urgent register of people building a case. He caught a few words. Wiesengemot. Evidence. Precedent. And once, clearly, he needs to know the full picture before anyone else tries to manage it. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 11 years, Harry Potter fell asleep without listening for footsteps outside his door. Outside, in the Ministry's ward network, the parchment trail was already accumulating. Healers' reports, ward transcripts, 10 years of child welfare records that had never been requested and never been filed because no one had ever asked. In her office on level 2, Amelia Bones was working past midnight, and the pile on her desk was growing, and her expression was becoming the specific kind of quiet fury that very competent people wore when they realized exactly how badly they'd been failed by the systems they'd spent their careers building. And across London, in his tower office at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore sat very still with his fingers steepled beneath his chin and his half-moon glasses reflecting the candlelight and an expression on his face that was not guilt. It was something more complicated than guilt, something that believed in itself too much to be guilt, and he thought about his next move. He had many. He had always had many. But for the first time in a very long time, he was not entirely certain that any of them would be enough. Chapter 2. What the records say. Harry woke to the sound of someone arguing in the corridor. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious, which was a habit built over 10 years of needing to know, immediately and always, what the noise was about and whether it was coming for him. He stood in the middle of the room in yesterday's clothes, heart rate already settling as his brain caught up, Ministry, secure housing, not Privet Drive, and listened. Two voices. A man he didn't recognize, smooth and unhurried, the kind of voice that had been educated into confidence. And Amelia Bones, who sounded like someone who had slept 3 hours and had zero patience remaining for whatever the smooth voice was attempting. Simply a courtesy notification, Amelia. The headmaster has a legitimate interest in. The headmaster is a named party in an active DMLE investigation. He has no access to witnesses, no access to evidence, and absolutely no access to this building until I say otherwise. That is not a courtesy, Dawlish, that's the law. With respect, the headmaster's position, his position is noted and his access is denied. Are we finished? A pause. The smooth voice tried once more, lower now, the register of someone switching from official to personal. He's worried about the boy, Amelia. That's all this is. Then he should have worried 10 years ago. Her voice was completely flat. Good morning, Dawlish. Footsteps. A door. Harry sat back down on the bed and thought about what he'd just heard. Witness. She called him a witness. Not a victim, not a child, not a case number. A witness, which meant he was someone whose account of things had standing, whose version of events mattered in a legal framework. The distinction felt important in a way he was still calibrating. He was also thinking about Dumbledore. He knew the name, everyone knew the name, it was on every chocolate frog card, Defeater of Grindelwald, Supreme Mugwump, Order of Merlin First Class. He'd expected to meet him at Hogwarts as the headmaster, a remote figure of authority. He had not expected to meet his name on a DMLE report as the person who'd put him in a cupboard in Surrey and apparently never looked back. He was working through exactly what he felt about this when someone knocked. Come in, he said. Tonks opened the door looking marginally less frantic than yesterday, her hair a more subdued pink-brown that suggested she'd made at least a partial effort at inconspicuous. She had a tray with breakfast on it, Rio breakfast, the kind with eggs and toast, and a small pot of tea, and she put it on the desk with the slightly guilty air of someone who kept wanting to apologize and was restraining herself. Morning, she said. How'd you sleep? Better than usual, Harry said honestly. She nodded, then sat in the chair across from him without being invited, which he found he didn't mind. She had the kind of energy that was too large for formality. Healer Cavendish is coming back this morning, she said. She wants to do a treatment session, nothing uncomfortable, just potions mostly. Nutritive drafts, bone strengthening, that sort of thing. And Madame Bones wants to see you at 10. She paused. She also said to tell you that a letter arrived for you this morning. Harry looked up. From Hogwarts. The deputy headmistress. Tonks produced an envelope from her pocket. The seal was Hogwarts' crest in dark red wax. Not Dumbledore. McGonagall. Madame Bones read it. Investigative protocol, she said to tell you that, and also that you're allowed to be annoyed about it. Harry took it. He almost smiled. He opened it. The handwriting was precise and upright, the kind that had been practiced until it became personality. Dear Mr. Potter, I have been informed of your current situation by Madame Bones, to whom I spoke directly this morning. I want you to know that your place at Hogwarts is secure, your house assignment will wait for your arrival, and your belongings are being held safely in my office. I also want you to know, independently of my role as deputy headmistress, that I am deeply sorry. I visited Privet Drive once, in 1981, before the placement was finalized. I told Albus at the time that the situation was wrong. I should have done more than tell him. I intend to do more now. Yours, Professor M. McGonagall. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. All right? Tonks asked. Yeah, he said. He picked up the toast. Yeah, I think so. Healer Cavendish arrived at 8 with a case of potions that clinked gently and an efficiency that Harry found oddly comforting. She was a practical woman in her 40s who explained everything before she did it. This one tastes like grass. I'm sorry, it'll pass. This one will make your arm ache for about 20 minutes where the fractures were. That's normal. This one is just vitamins and it tastes like pumpkin juice. And she didn't soften the diagnostic report or try to make it less than it was. Your magical core is interesting, she said, making notes on her scroll while Harry drank something that did, regrettably, taste exactly like grass. The suppression isn't damage, exactly. More like, do you know what happens to a plant that's kept in a very small pot for years? It stops growing properly, Harry said. The roots have nowhere to go. Exactly right. Your core didn't stop developing. It just had nowhere to express. 10 years of magic with no outlet, no training, no acknowledgement that it existed. She looked at him over her scroll. When you start casting, Mr. Potter, I would strongly suggest you have a patient teacher. Not because you're behind, you're not, in terms of raw potential, but because the amount of magic looking for a channel after a decade of constraint is going to surprise you. How much? Harry asked. Put it this way. She capped her ink. Most first-year students can manage simple spells in the first few weeks of practice. I'd expect you to manage them in the first few attempts. She said it in the same tone she'd used to report any other medical finding, factual, unimpressed, simply true. The constraint didn't diminish you. It just compressed you. Harry thought about that image, 10 years of magic with nowhere to go, coiled up inside him like something waiting. It felt accurate. It felt like something he'd always known about himself without having the framework to name. The fractures, he said. Were they? Could you tell how old they were? She was quiet for a moment. The arm fracture was between the ages of 6 and 8, she said carefully. The ribs were more recent. 7 to 9. He nodded. He didn't ask anything else about it. She didn't push. Amelia Bones's office, it turned out, was not in the secure housing wing but on level 2 of the Ministry proper, and the walk there was Harry's first proper look at the Ministry of Magic. He noted the golden statues in the atrium, a wizard and witch and various magical creatures arranged in a composition that seemed to say something pointed about who was on top and who was decorative, and filed it for later consideration. He noted the way people looked at him as he crossed the floor with Kingsley at his side, a ripple of recognition, the specific double-take of people who had seen his face on chocolate frog cards since childhood and were now recalibrating. He looked straight ahead and kept moving. Amelia's office was large and thoroughly functional, which matched her. Files everywhere, organized in a way that looked chaotic but clearly wasn't. A window with a view of an animated courtyard. A desk that had clearly been awake all night. She was standing when they came in, which he noted. She didn't make him walk toward a seated authority figure, which was a small thing that registered anyway. Harry. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, the good one without wobble. Sleep well? Better than usual, he said again. Good. She sat. I'm going to tell you what we've found so far, and then I want your permission to do something. Are you all right with that approach? He nodded. Right. She opened the first file. We pulled the original placement documentation from 1981. On November 1st of that year, Dumbledore placed you with your mother's sister and her husband under what's called Blood Ward protections, an ancient protective magic tied to the sacrifice your mother made. The theory was that as long as you lived in the home of a blood relative who took you in willingly, certain dark magic couldn't reach you. Did it work? Harry asked. The protective aspect? Yes, probably. The issue. She turned a page. Is that the Magical Child Welfare Act requires that any placement, including emergency ones, be reviewed within 6 months and formally assessed annually thereafter. No review was ever conducted. Not once in 10 years. She said this without inflection, which somehow made it worse. The placement existed entirely outside normal oversight because Dumbledore bypassed the standard channels. He had authority to do so under wartime emergency provisions, but those provisions expired in 1982. The placement should have been formally reviewed and potentially transferred to a proper wizarding guardian after that. But it wasn't, Harry said. But it wasn't. Because... She paused, and chose her next words with visible care. No one asked? The wards at Platform 9 3/4 exist precisely for situations like this, but their alerts go to the DMLE duty officer, and the duty officer in 1991 would have filed a report. That report would have gone to the child welfare liaison, who would have forwarded it to the department head, who should have. She stopped. What? Harry said. She looked at him steadily. The ward alerts at Platform 9 3/4 for the last 8 years were all routed through a secondary protocol that filed them to a restricted archive instead of the active duty desk. She turned the file toward him so he could see the document, a bureaucratic authorization form with a signature at the bottom. That protocol was put in place in 1983. Harry read the signature. He looked up. He rerouted the alerts. Harry said, "The investigation is still determining the full chain of authorization," she said carefully. "But yes. That is what the evidence currently suggests." The room was very quiet for a moment. Harry thought about what that meant. It meant it wasn't oversight. It wasn't bureaucratic failure. Someone had looked at a system designed to catch harm to children, and had specifically rerouted it so that the harm to one particular child would stay invisible. He sat with that for a while. He didn't feel shock, exactly. Shock required expecting better. He felt something more like the cold clarity of a thing confirming what he'd suspected in the wordless animal part of you all along. "You said you wanted my permission for something," Harry said. "Yes." She folded her hands. "I want to formally open a criminal investigation. Full Wiesengemat review. This goes beyond child welfare violations into something more significant, deliberate obstruction of a protective ward system, which is a serious magical offense. I want to do this properly, which means I need your cooperation as the primary witness. I also," she held his gaze, "want to be honest with you about what that means." "It'll be a fight," Harry said. "Yes. Dumbledore has allies in every significant institution in this country. The Prophet will likely defend him initially. There will be people who say the placement was wartime necessity, that he was protecting you, that the ends justified the means." Her voice didn't change. "And there will be pressure. On me, on the investigation, and potentially on you." "Okay," Harry said. She blinked just slightly. "Okay? I mean yes. Do the investigation. Do all of it." He leaned forward slightly. "I've spent 11 years with people telling me I was imagining things. That the way I lived was normal. That asking for more was being difficult." His voice was still flat, but there was something underneath it, something with teeth. "I want it on a record. All of it. I want someone to have to look at it, and call it what it is." Amelia Bones looked at him for a long moment. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. The afternoon was bureaucratic in a way that Harry, who had spent 10 years being invisible to systems, found surprisingly satisfying when the systems were finally pointed in the right direction. There were forms, formal witness statements, evidence authorizations, a guardianship application that Amelia filed immediately for temporary protective custody pending a full hearing. There was a second visit from Healer Cavendish with more potions and a follow-up diagnostic that showed the nutritive drafts were already doing something noticeable in the skin results, which pleased the healer in a professionally restrained way. And at 4 in the afternoon, there was an unexpected visitor. He heard the voice before Tonks brought her in, a quick bright voice with the specific cadence of someone who had organized their thoughts into numbered points before speaking and was very pleased about it. He looked up from the book Kingsley had brought him, A Beginner's Guide to Magical Law, which he'd asked for and which Kingsley had produced with the expression of someone not entirely surprised by the request, and the door opened to admit a girl his age with an enormous amount of bushy brown hair, 3 books under one arm, and an expression of intense purposeful sympathy that indicated she had heard about his situation and formed opinions. Behind her, looking mildly helpless, was Ron Weasley. "I'd brought her," Ron said by way of explanation or possibly apology. "She heard what happened and I asked to come," the girl said firmly. "I'm Hermione Granger. I was in the compartment next to yours on the train." She set her books on the table with the authority of someone establishing a territory. "I've been reading about the Platform 9 3/4 ward protocols since this morning." Harry looked at her. Then he looked at Ron, who shrugged in a way that communicated this is just who she is. How did you get here? Harry asked. Madam Bones agreed, Hermione said, sitting down without being invited, which Harry was beginning to think was a trait of people he was going to like. I think she thought it might be good for you to have peers present, and I told her I had relevant research, which I do. She opened the top book. Platform 9 3/4 was built in 1642. The ward system was designed by Rowena Ravenclaw herself, added retroactively in 1658 after a case of, well, that's not the point. The point is the wards have a legal precedent as evidence in Wiesengemat proceedings. They've been used as evidence in 3 prior cases. Which means the ward report from yesterday isn't just an administrative alert, Harry said slowly. It's legal evidence in its own right. Hermione beamed at him with the specific delight of someone who has found a person who follows the logic. Exactly. The wards are classified as a certified magical instrument under the Magical Evidence Standards Act of 1803, which means their outputs are admissible as primary evidence without requiring additional witness testimony to substantiate them. You don't have to prove anything. The wards already proved it. Ron sat down and looked at them both. I understood about half of that, he said cheerfully. The half that matters, Harry told him, is that the evidence already exists, and someone deliberately hid it. Yeah, Ron said. That half I got. He looked at Harry with the same directness he'd had on the train, stripped of pretense. My mum, when I told her what happened on the train, she went quiet in a way that she never does. And then she said Dumbledore always knew what was best. He paused. I don't think she meant it badly. I think she really believes it. But I thought you should know. Harry nodded. He appreciated the honesty. The Weasleys know Dumbledore? Everyone knows Dumbledore, Ron said. But yeah, more than most. He searched for the word, sort of present in our family. During the war and after. My dad works for the Ministry, and Dumbledore and the Ministry. He made a vague gesture. Are you going to be in trouble? Harry asked. For being here? Ron considered this with a pragmatism that suited him. Probably a bit, he said. Mum'll worry. But she worries about everything. He shrugged. You're my friend. You were my friend before any of this happened. That doesn't stop because it got complicated. Harry had nothing to say to that, so he said nothing, which Ron seemed to understand was not unfriendly. I also, Hermione said, pulling out a second book with the air of someone who has been patient long enough, have been reading about core suppression and what happens when it's released, which I thought you might find useful, Harry, given what Healer Cavendish said. Can I? Yes, Harry said. Go ahead. She went ahead. She went ahead for 40 minutes, and it was dense and technical and occasionally veered into tangents she had to visibly discipline herself out of, and Harry followed every word of it while Ron ate biscuits someone had left on the tray and interjected with questions that were, despite his self-deprecating manner, genuinely good questions. It was the best afternoon Harry had had in living memory, which was a low bar but also a real one. What Hermione had found, laid out in the clear light of actual information rather than fear or mystery, was this: a suppressed magical core, when the suppressive environment was removed, went through a period of rapid recalibration. Like a compressed spring releasing. The magic didn't come out as uncontrolled bursts. That was a myth, Hermione said firmly, but as an increased sensitivity to intent. Spells that required weeks to learn in a normal environment took days. Spells that required days took hours. Not because the person was more talented, but because the core had spent years learning to respond to minute changes in internal state, since there was no external channel. Your magic learned to read you, Hermione said. Because it had to. It couldn't go anywhere, so it went inward. Harry held his hand out, palm up, and thought about light. Nothing happened. Then something happened that wasn't quite light. A warmth, a visible shimmer, like heat rising from summer pavement. It lasted about 2 seconds and then dissipated, and his hand tingled for a minute afterward. Hermione and Ron were both staring at him. I wasn't trying to cast a spell, Harry said. I just thought about it. You didn't have a wand, Hermione breathed. I don't have a wand, Harry said. My wand's at Hogwarts. McGonagall has it. That was wandless, Ron said. That was wandless intentional magic. My mum can't do wandless magic, and she's been casting for 30 years. Harry looked at his hand. The tingle was fading. Huh, he said. He didn't sleep as easily that second night. Not because anything was wrong, but because things were right in ways that kept demanding to be processed. He lay in the dark and thought about everything Hermione had told him, and thought about the shimmer of light over his palm, and thought about Amelia Bones saying that is what the evidence currently suggests with the implacable patience of someone building a wall brick by brick. He thought about Dumbledore. He tried to be fair about it, in the way that being fair was a useful analytical tool rather than an emotional obligation. He thought about what a person might tell themselves, justifying 10 years of deliberate neglect. The blood wards protected him. The sacrifice was necessary. He needed to not know who he was, not feel entitled to magic or power, because entitled children became dangerous ones. He could construct the argument. He was good at constructing arguments. It was something you got good at when the adults around you were always wrong but always had reasons. The thing about the argument was that it was internally coherent. That was the dangerous part. You could follow its logic and end up somewhere monstrous without having made any obviously wrong turns. He thought about that for a long time. Then he thought about the wards, Ravenclaw's wards, built into Platform 9 3.25 centuries ago, that had looked at him and said no. Not with calculation, not with competing priorities, not with the long view or the greater good. Just, no. This child has been harmed. This is not acceptable. Alert. There was something in the absolute simplicity of that which felt like the truest thing that had happened to him in 11 years. He fell asleep thinking about what he wanted to learn first. Practical magic, obviously. He needed spells, needed to close the gap between himself and students who'd been practicing since childhood. Defense, definitely. Charms, because Hermione's enthusiasm for them was slightly contagious. And the law. He wanted to understand the laws of the magical world with the thoroughness of someone who intended to be very difficult to manipulate by people who assumed he didn't know them. The next morning, Amelia Bones knocked on his door before breakfast. She had a look on her face that he was beginning to recognize, controlled, precise, professionally composed, with something working underneath it that she was choosing when to show. Dumbledore has requested a private meeting, she said. With you. Harry looked at her. What did you say? I said that the request would be passed on and that any communication with you goes through me until guardianship is formally established. She paused. He has also, through several intermediaries, which is interesting in itself, suggested to 3 Wizengamot members that the investigation may be motivated by political rivalries rather than genuine child welfare concerns. He's moving fast, Harry said. Yes. She looked at him with something that might have been assessment, and might have been something warmer. What do you want to do? About the meeting request. Harry thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to think about it clearly. Not yet, he said. He can wait until there's a formal structure around it. Until we're in front of the Wizengamot, and there's a record being made. He paused. Then I'll talk to him. Where there are witnesses. Amelia Bones nodded slowly. Good answer. Also, Harry said, can I have a wand? Not mine, I know mine's at Hogwarts. But I'd like to start learning. Healer Cavendish said the core recalibration is nearly done, and Hermione has notes. She stopped in the doorway. Turned back. Looked at him with an expression he still couldn't entirely name but which had, in its depths, something that looked a great deal like respect. I'll talk to Ollivander, she said. Ollivander arrived at noon. He was a slight, pale man with silver eyes that gave the impression they were made of the same stuff as moonlight, and saw everything through and through. He came in carrying a large case and looked at Harry for a long moment before saying anything. "I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter," he said, which Harry already knew from Diagon Alley. "I remember selling your parents their wands. I remember." He paused, something moving across his face. "I remember knowing the night those wands were used for the last time, that something tremendous had happened." He set the case down. "I was told you were placed safely. I assumed." "Everyone assumed," Harry said, without particular rancor. Ollivander looked at him sharply, and then nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a correction he deserved. "Your primary wand is at Hogwarts," he said. "Holly and Phoenix Feather, 11 inches. But for these purposes," he opened the case, "we might try something that speaks to what you currently are rather than what you were at 10 years old when the wandwood chose its core." He tried 6 wands before the 7th one made the room feel like a thunderstorm condensing to a single point. 12 inches. Blackthorn and dragon heartstring. Unyielding. The warmth that went up his arm when he wrapped his fingers around it was nothing like the shimmer from yesterday, that had been a whisper. This was a voice. He cast Lumos without instruction, without practice, having read about it once in the standard book of spells the week before, and the light that bloomed from the tip of the wand was steady and bright, and utterly controlled. Ollivander looked at it for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "is not a first attempt." "No," Harry agreed. He turned the wand over in his hand. "Can I keep this one? Until I get back to Hogwarts for the Holly one. I'll add it to the DMLE's evidence voucher," Ollivander said, which was not an answer, but then looked at Amelia Bones, who nodded. "Yes," he amended. "You can keep it." He spent the rest of that afternoon with Hermione and Ron and a stack of first-year spell books and discovered that Healer Cavendish had, if anything, understated the case. He worked through 6 spells in 2 hours. Not perfectly, there was still technique, still nuance that he was learning in real time, but they worked, with a consistency and solidity that made Hermione's note-taking increasingly excited and made Ron say, at one point, Mate, you just cast Wingardium Leviosa 3 times in a row and it's been 2 minutes. Is that fast?" Harry asked. "It took my brother Percy 3 weeks," Ron said. "Hermione got it in an hour, I think," Harry said, because he noticed Hermione doing it quietly in the corner about 40 minutes ago. Hermione looked up from her notes, with a slightly guilty expression. "Hour and a half," she said. "The wrist movement is tricky." "It wasn't for me," Harry said, and then immediately felt self-conscious about saying it, which was new and slightly uncomfortable. But Hermione just grinned, wide and genuine. "Of course it wasn't. Your core's been doing nothing but learning precision for 11 years. The gross motor component would be trivial for you." She made a note. "This is very exciting. I mean," she added, catching herself, "not the circumstances. The circumstances are awful. But the magic is genuinely fascinating. I can hold both those things," Harry said. She looked at him with the expression she wore when something pleased her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you can." Outside, down the long ministry corridors, a paper airplane memo was making its way to Amelia Bones' desk, a response from the Weisengamat scheduling office. The hearing was set. 3 days from now. Harry didn't know that yet. He was levitating a book and thinking about precision, about the shape of intention before it became action, about all the magic that had spent 11 years learning the exact contours of who he was because there was nowhere else to go. He let the book down gently, on purpose, in exactly the spot he'd chosen. Chapter 3. The Gambit. The Weisengamat chamber was older than the ministry building that contained it. Harry knew this because Hermione had told him, and Hermione had told him because she'd read the architectural history of the ministry in an afternoon, and retained it the way other people retained song lyrics. The chamber dated to the 12th century, she'd said, which meant the stone walls and the tiered seating and the enormous magical ceiling that showed whatever sky existed directly above the earth at that spot had been here long before the atrium's golden statues or the polished marble floors or the elevator system with its paper airplane memos. The magic in the walls was old and specific and did not care about politics or reputation or the accumulated weight of a man's lifetime of accomplishments. Harry stood in the anteroom outside it, and felt the wall's magic humming against his awareness the same way he'd felt the platform 9 3/4 wards, a kind of attention, old and impersonal and incorruptible. He liked it considerably. "You don't have to go in," Amelia said. She was beside him in her official DMLE robes, deep plum with silver trim, the monocle polished to a shine. She had the bearing of someone who had walked into difficult rooms many times and had never once walked back out. "Not today. The first session is evidentiary, documents, ward transcripts, Healer Cavendish's report. You won't be called as a witness until the second session at the earliest." "I know," Harry said. "I want to watch." She didn't argue. He noticed she didn't argue with him when he stated what he wanted, which was either professional respect or a recognition that he wasn't going to be moved. Probably both. "You'll be in the observer's gallery," she said. "Kingsley will be next to you. If anyone approaches you, I refer them to you and say nothing," he said. "Good." She paused, looking at him with that calibrating expression. He was getting better at reading it. There was always a calculation happening behind it, but it wasn't a cold one. It was the kind of calculation a person made when they were responsible for something that mattered and they took that responsibility seriously. "How are you feeling?" "Interested," Harry said, which was true. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Right." She straightened her robes. "Stay close to Kingsley. And Harry, whatever he says in there, and he will say things that are designed to reframe everything, I need you to just listen," Harry said. "I know. I've been listening to people lie to me my whole life. I know what it sounds like." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You're going to be all right, aren't you?" It was not a question. "I was always going to be all right," Harry said. "I just needed the room." The Wisengamot chamber held 200 seats in tiered rows, and today it was full. Harry had not expected that. He'd expected a formal legal proceeding, dry and procedural, maybe 30 people in robes. Instead, every seat was occupied, which told him something about the weight of the name at the center of this. You didn't fill a chamber for ordinary cases. You filled it when the case was the kind that forced everyone to pick a side. He sat in the observer's gallery on Kingsley's left, high enough to see everything. Kingsley said nothing, which Harry was grateful for. He just sat with his arms folded and his eyes moving steadily around the chamber, cataloging. The Wisengamot members were in purple robes with silver W's. There were about 50 of them in the formal seating, and the rest of the chamber was observers and press. He could identify the press by the quick quotes quills moving autonomously over parchment in the upper tiers. He would find out later that Rita Skeeter was among them. He would find out later what she'd written. For now he just noted the quills and their implications. Amelia Bones took her position at the prosecution table. Though it wasn't called that, in Wisengamot proceedings, it was called the presenting counsel's position, and arranged her files with the efficiency of someone who had spent 3 days building this particular structure, and knew exactly which stone went where. Across from her, at the respondent's position, sat a man named Cornelius Fudge, who was the Minister for Magic and who, Harry had been informed by Kingsley in a low voice on the way in, was there in the capacity of character witness and advisor rather than as a party to the proceedings. He was a small round man in lime green robes who kept touching his bowler hat even though he wasn't wearing it, the hat being on the table beside him. He looked worried in a specific way, the way of a man who understood that this proceeding threatened something he relied on. And then Albus Dumbledore came in. He came in through the main doors rather than a side entrance, which was a choice. He walked at a measured pace that was neither hurried nor overly slow, his deep blue robes moving around him, his white hair and beard catching the chamber's magical light. His half-moon spectacles were polished. His expression was, and Harry watched it carefully, serene. Not innocent. Not anxious. Serene. The serenity of someone who had decided, before entering the room, exactly how this was going to go. He was magnificent, objectively. Harry could see why people followed him. Dumbledore reached his seat and settled into it, and then, as if performing a casual scan of the gallery, his gaze moved upward, and found Harry. He looked at Harry for 3 seconds with an expression of what appeared to be gentle, sorrowful concern, the expression of a grandfather who has made mistakes and wants very much to make amends. Harry looked back at him with absolutely nothing on his face. Dumbledore's expression didn't change, exactly, but something shifted behind it. A recalibration. Harry looked away first, not because he was uncomfortable but because he'd seen what he needed to see, and turned his attention to Amelia Bones, who had begun to speak. The evidentiary presentation took 2 hours. Amelia Bones was extraordinary at this. Harry didn't have a reference point for legal proceedings, he'd certainly never been in one, but he understood from the quality of attention in the room that what he was watching was someone operating at the top of their ability in the arena where their ability was most formidable. She presented the ward transcripts from Platform 9 3/4 first, establishing the legal standing of the wards as certified evidence, citing Hermione's 3 precedents, which made Harry think of Hermione with something warm, and then walked through the diagnostic report point by point. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. She let the numbers speak, and the numbers were devastating. Chronic malnutrition, 7+ years. Improperly healed fractures. Suppressed magical core development measurably inconsistent with natural variation. These were Healer Cavendish's findings, certified by St. Mungo's, and they sat in the room like stones dropped into water. You could watch the ripples move through the tiered seats, the small shifts in posture and expression as Wizengamot members absorbed what they were hearing. Then she presented the placement documentation. And then the compliance records, or rather, the absence of them. No welfare review was conducted in October 1982, she said, moving along the timeline she'd constructed. Despite the mandatory 6-month requirement. No review was conducted in 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, or 1991. She let the list sit. In 10 years, no ministry official, no independent assessor, no representative of magical child welfare ever visited number 4, Privet Drive. Someone in the Wizengamot seating, an older witch with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that Harry would later learn belonged to Griselda Marchbanks, said clearly. That is a decade of non-compliance. It is, Amelia confirmed. Then she put up the ward rerouting documentation. The protocol authorizing the rerouting of Platform 9 3/4 alert outputs from the active duty desk to a restricted archive. Dated 1983. The ministry registration number for the authorization. And at the bottom, the signature. The chamber got very quiet. Dumbledore's expression did not change. His serenity remained entirely intact. This was what made him, Harry was beginning to understand, genuinely formidable in a way that had nothing to do with magical power. He had the ability to receive devastating evidence against himself and respond with the expression of a man being shown a mildly disappointing weather forecast. He rose when the chief warlock indicated it was his opportunity to respond, and he spoke in the voice that had presumably opened 1,000 great occasions, warm, resonant, unhurried, the voice of someone who had decided before speaking that they were the most trustworthy person in the room. The decisions made in the autumn of 1981, Dumbledore began, were made in the shadow of the worst darkness this world has seen in living memory. Voldemort. And here, several people flinched, which Dumbledore noted with a gentle patience that said he was accustomed to being braver about names than other people. Had just been defeated by a miracle of sacrificial love that none of us understood, or understand yet today. In that context, I made choices designed entirely around one priority, the survival of the child. He looked up at the gallery then, very briefly. The blood protections required Harry to live with his mother's family. That was not a preference. That was the mechanics of the magic. His mother's sacrifice created a protection so profound that as long as Harry could call his aunt's house home, the forces that sought his destruction could not reach him. To move him, to place him with a wizarding family, would have been to strip him of that protection. Knowing what we knew about Voldemort's remaining forces, his followers, his possible survival, I made the only decision available to me. He paused, letting this settle. The failures of oversight you describe, he said to Amelia, with a tone of measured acknowledgement that was exquisitely calibrated to sound like honesty, are genuine, and I accept responsibility for them. They arose not from indifference but from a wartime administrator's error of judgment. I should have established formal review processes rather than relying on my own periodic assessments of Harry's safety. Another pause. As for the ward rerouting, that protocol was established to prevent mass panic. Had it become publicly known that Harry Potter was living with Muggle relatives, the remaining Death Eater forces would have had a targeting vector within days. I made a calculated decision to minimize that risk. He sat down. The chamber was working through this, visibly. Harry could feel the weight of the argument. It was good, genuinely good, logically sound in its individual components. The blood protection argument was real. The Death Eater concern was real. If you were disposed to trust the man, you had everything you needed to keep trusting him. If you were disposed to trust the institutions, the oversight processes, the ward systems, the decade of silence, you had something else entirely. Amelia let the silence last exactly as long as it needed to. Then she said, "Could you describe, for the Wizengamot, the nature of your periodic assessments of Harry Potter's conditions at Privet Drive?" Dumbledore turned his gaze to her with the patience of a man who had anticipated the question. "I was satisfied," he said, "that the protective magic was functioning. And his physical circumstances? His welfare? I had no reason to believe they were inadequate." "You had no reason," Amelia repeated with a tone that touched each word separately, "to believe they were inadequate. Over 10 years. That is correct." She opened a file. Minerva McGonagall visited Privet Drive on October 31, 1981, the night before the placement was finalized. She provided a written assessment to the Hogwarts staff record, which I have here. She lifted a piece of parchment. She describes the street as the most unmagical place I've ever been, describes the family as the worst sort of muggles imaginable, and describes having the gravest misgivings about leaving Harry here. She states explicitly that she told Albus these concerns. She set the parchment down. "Did she tell you these concerns, Professor?" A pause. The first real pause Dumbledore had taken. "Minerva was concerned," he said. "Yes. I addressed those concerns in our conversation." "How did you address them?" "I explained the necessity of the blood protections." "You explained why he had to be there," Amelia said. "Did you take any steps to ensure the conditions were adequate? A single visit? A welfare check by any party?" You trusted the people who were documented, in your own deputy's assessment, as the worst sort of muggles imaginable," Amelia said, "to provide appropriate care for an 11-month-old child who had just lost both parents. For 10 years. She closed the file. No further questions at this stage. The gallery shifted. The quick quotes quills moved faster. Griselda Marchbanks, in the Wizengamot seating, was writing something in rapid, sharp strokes. 2 seats away from her, Harry noticed a wizard he didn't recognize leaning toward his neighbor and whispering, the whisper of someone recalculating. Fudge, at his table, had stopped touching where his hat wasn't and had begun touching his actual collar instead. Dumbledore sat with his hands folded on the table and his expression of serenity subtly different from what it had been at the start. Not cracked. Not broken. But adjusted. The serenity of a man who has encountered a higher quality resistance than he expected and is revising his approach in real time. He looked up at the gallery again. At Harry. And this time, Harry smiled at him. Small, precise, entirely deliberate. Dumbledore looked away. The hearing broke for midday. Harry found Ron and Hermione waiting outside the chamber, Hermione practically vibrating, Ron eating a sandwich with the steady composure of someone who processed stress through lunch. "She was brilliant," Hermione said immediately. The ward precedents were perfectly placed, and the way she let him make the blood protection argument before introducing McGonagall's memo, that was deliberate sequencing. She let him commit to no reason to believe conditions were inadequate before proving he had every reason. "I know," Harry said. "I washed. The rerouting protocol is the biggest thing," Hermione continued, falling into step beside him as Kingsley steered them toward a quieter corridor. "Because the blood protection argument is defensible. It's wrong in application, but it's not obviously criminal. The rerouting is different. He didn't just fail to check on you. He made sure no one else could check either. That's active obstruction. He's going to pivot," Harry said. Both of them looked at him. "He's already moving," Harry said. The Death Eater targeting argument was new. It wasn't in any of the prior public statements about where I lived. He introduced it today because it's the argument that reframes the rerouting as protection rather than concealment. He thought for a moment. He needs to complicate the picture before the second session. "Before I testify." "What do you think he'll do?" Ron asked. "I think he'll try to talk to me before then," Harry said. "Through channels that aren't official. Someone I might trust, someone from his side who seems reasonable." He thought about the Weasleys. He didn't say it. But he thought about it. Ron caught something in his expression. "My mum's been writing," Ron said in the carefully neutral tone of someone being honest about something uncomfortable. "She sent me 3 letters this morning. She's worried about you. She thinks..." He paused. "She thinks Dumbledore was doing his best, and this is all a misunderstanding, and maybe you should just talk to him." "Your mum's a good person," Harry said. "Yeah, she is. And she trusts him completely." "Yeah," Ron said. "She does." They walked for a moment. "That doesn't have to be a problem between us," Harry said. "Your mum can trust him, and you can think for yourself." Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She'd be upset if she heard me say I think he was wrong." "Probably. But he was wrong," Ron said with the simple directness that was his most consistent quality. "Whatever his reasons. Living in a cupboard and not eating enough and nobody checking on you for 10 years. That's not protection. That's abandonment with a theory attached." Harry stopped walking. Ron looked at him, slightly uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he'd said something offensive. "Yeah," Harry said. "That's exactly what it is." Ron nodded once. They kept walking. The message arrived that evening, as Harry had predicted. Not through Amelia, not through official channels, through a Hogwarts owl that landed on the window of his ministry room with a letter addressed in familiar looping script. Not Dumbledore's hand. Someone else's. "Dear Harry, my name is not important. What is important is that I have known Professor Dumbledore for many years and I genuinely believe he cares about your welfare, whatever the proceedings today might suggest. I think a private conversation, before this goes any further, might help you understand the full picture. There are things about your situation, your history, your significance to the wizarding world, that Dumbledore feels you need to understand in the right context. He has information that should come from him directly. Please consider it." Harry folded the letter and brought it straight to Amelia. She read it, her expression not changing in any visible way, which he was learning was her version of genuine feeling. The more controlled she got, the stronger the feeling underneath. "Who brought this?" she said. "Ministry owl. Could have been anyone. The phrasing." She touched the letter. "This is..." She stopped herself. "I have a guess about who wrote this, but I need to verify before I say anything. Can I keep it?" "Yes." Harry had already memorized it. "He's going to try to tell me something about why I matter that he thinks will change how I'm approaching this." "The prophecy," Amelia said quietly, almost to herself. Harry's attention sharpened. "What prophecy?" She looked at him, and in that look was something he hadn't seen from her before, a hesitation, the specific kind that meant she was weighing whether to tell him something that would change things. "There is a prophecy," she said carefully. "In the Hall of Prophecy, in the Department of Mysteries. Recorded in 1980. I know it exists. I do not know its full content. But I know that Dumbledore does, and I know that it concerns Voldemort and a child born at the end of July." She paused. "It was almost certainly the reason he considered your placement at Privet Drive so critical." Harry sat with this. "So there's a prophecy about me," he said. "And whatever it says, he used it to justify all of it." "Possibly," she said. "Or used it to convince himself the justification was sound. What's the difference?" "Intent," she said. "Which matters legally, if not personally." She looked at him. "I'm going to try to get the full prophecy text before the second session. If it becomes evidence, he'll fight that," Harry said. "Yes. Extremely hard." She tapped the letter against her desk. "Harry, whatever the prophecy says, I want you to understand that it does not change the legal basis of this case. You were harmed. The harm was preventable and was in fact actively perpetuated. The existence of a prophecy is not a legal defense for child abuse." "I know," Harry said. "I just want to know what it says." She looked at him. "When I have it, you'll hear it from me first." "That's a promise." The second half of the hearing reconvened the following morning, and it was different in quality from the first, tighter, more electric, the way a room felt when the procedural groundwork was done, and what remained was the thing itself. Amelia had done something overnight. Harry didn't know exactly what, but when she arrived at the chamber she had a second folder he hadn't seen before, and her expression had the quality of someone who has added a significant piece to a structure that was already load-bearing. Dumbledore arrived with 3 additional people behind him, supporters in Wizengamot robes who had clearly been contacted overnight and brought on side. More maneuvering. He had also, Harry noticed, changed his approach slightly. The robes were slightly less ceremonial today, the expression slightly less serene and slightly more humanly troubled. He'd heard the room yesterday. He was adjusting. The chief warlock opened the session and called the first witness. Minerva McGonagall walked in and took the witness position with a spine so straight it seemed to have opinions. Harry had only seen her in the letter. In person she was different, sharper, more compressed, with the specific manner of someone who had been angry for a very long time and had learned to be rigorous about when and how it showed. She was in Hogwarts teaching robes, green tartan, and she sat down and folded her hands and looked at the chief warlock with an expression that was perfectly composed and completely unafraid. Amelia approached her with the quietness of someone who has prepared this conversation thoroughly. "Professor McGonagall, you visited Privet Drive on October 31st, 1981? "I did." "What was your assessment of the placement?" "That it was unsuitable," she said without inflection. "The family was deeply unpleasant. They were hostile to the concept of magic in a way that went beyond ordinary Muggle discomfort. They had an infant son who was already being indulged in ways that suggested Harry's presence would be resented. I spent a day watching that street and I knew that it was wrong." "And you conveyed this to Dumbledore?" "I told Albus directly that I disagreed with the placement." She paused. "He told me that the blood protections were essential and irreplaceable, and that Harry would be better off growing up away from fame and expectation." Her jaw was tight. I accepted his reasoning. It was the worst professional decision of my life. "You accepted it," Amelia said. "Did you ever go back?" "Visit check, no." The word was quiet and absolute. "I accepted it, and I didn't go back, and I have to live with that." She looked at the Wizengamot seating. "I have sat with that for 10 years. I am not here to mitigate my own failure. I am here because what was done to that child was wrong, and because being in a position of responsibility that was misused to enable harm means you have a duty to stand up and say so clearly, whatever the personal cost." In the observer's gallery, Harry watched Minerva McGonagall and felt something adjust in him. The defense counsel, a wizard in expensive robes named Greengrass, whom Harry clocked as 3 times sharper than Fudge, rose for cross-examination. Professor McGonagall, you raised concerns about the placement in 1981. You then accepted the headmaster's reasoning. For the following 10 years, did you make any official report, any formal complaint, any attempt to revisit the question? No, she said. You have been deputy headmistress for 20 years. You have standing to make welfare referrals independently of the headmaster's office. I do. And you made none? I made none. She met the questioning with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this internal prosecution long before any legal version of it arrived. That is my failure to answer for. So the woman presenting herself today as a witness to Professor Dumbledore's alleged negligence was herself negligent for a decade. Greengrass said, with the smooth, surgical accuracy of a good lawyer. Yes, McGonagall said. We both were. The difference is that I'm in this room admitting it. The chamber stirred. Greengrass sat down slightly faster than he'd intended to. Harry testified in the afternoon session. He'd known it was coming. Amelia had warned him the night before that Greengrass would try to characterize his account as the distorted perspective of a child who didn't know what normal was. She told him to just answer what was asked, nothing more. He'd listened and then had decided he would answer what was asked and also anything else that seemed pertinent, which was not exactly what she'd advised but which she had, when he described his intention, not told him not to do. He sat in the witness position and looked at the Wizengamot, and felt the old magic in the walls paying attention. The chief warlock confirmed his identity and age, and Amelia walked him through the factual account, the cupboard, the food, the fractures, the incidents of accidental magic and the punishments that followed. He answered in the same flat factual voice he'd used with Kingsley and Amelia, because the facts were enough and he was not here to perform suffering. The silence that spread through the chamber, as he spoke, was not the silence of boredom. Then Greengrass rose. Harry, he said, with a warmth that identified itself immediately as strategy. First, I want to say that everything you've described sounds genuinely difficult, and I have no wish to minimize your experience. Thank you, Harry said. You've only been in the wizarding world for a few weeks. Is that right? Just over a month, yes. So your understanding of magical law, of blood protections, of what was magically necessary in the aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, all of this is very new to you. Some of it, Harry said. I've been reading. Greengrass smiled in a way that assumed this was endearing rather than relevant. Of course. But you'd agree that there's a great deal about the circumstances of your placement that you couldn't fully understand? The war, the threat, the complexity of the magical protections involved? I understand enough, Harry said. What I'm suggesting, Greengrass said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something to someone young, is that what felt like neglect from a child's perspective might have been a painful necessity from an adult one. That the headmaster's choices, however imperfect in execution, came from a place of genuine. He rerouted the ward alerts, Harry said. Greengrass paused. The wards are designed to find children who are being harmed, Harry said. They triggered for me. The reports would have gone to the DMLE duty desk, which would have sent someone to check on me. That would have happened automatically, every year, from 1983. Someone deliberately changed where those reports went so they never reached anyone who could act on them. He looked at Greengrass with the clarity of someone who has had 3 days to think this through and did not come here to be managed. I understand blood protections. I understand wartime necessity. What I don't understand is why protecting me from Death Eaters required making sure no one could find out I was being harmed. Those aren't the same thing. They never were. The chamber was absolutely still. Greengrass said nothing for a moment. Then, you're 11 years old. Yes, Harry said. I am. And I spent 7 of those years in a cupboard, and my ribs healed crooked because nobody was allowed to know about it. He paused. I don't need to be older than 11 to know that's wrong. I just needed someone to listen. He heard, from somewhere in the Wizengamot seating, the scratching of Griselda Marchbank's quill. Greengrass sat down. Dumbledore was looking at Harry with an expression that was genuinely hard to parse, not anger, not the serene performance. Something more honest than either. Something that looked, for just a moment, like a man seeing himself from the outside for the first time and finding the view unexpected. Harry looked back. Then he looked at Amelia, who was watching him with the slight relaxation in the set of her shoulders that was her equivalent of relief. He stepped down from the witness position and walked back to the gallery. The chief warlock called for a 3-day recess while the Wizengamot deliberated. In the corridor outside, Hermione was waiting with both hands clasped together and an expression of barely contained feeling. Ron was next to her, and when Harry came through the door, Ron said simply, "Good," in the way of someone for whom that word covered everything. "The rerouting argument," Hermione said immediately. "That was the right pivot. Greengrass was trying to make it about your comprehension, and you brought it back to the single fact that can't be explained away regardless of your age or your understanding of blood magic." "I know," Harry said. "You planned that." "I thought about it last night," he said. "I figured he'd try to make me seem like I didn't understand the full picture. So I needed the one piece of the picture that didn't require any context to understand." Hermione stared at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just—" She stopped, reconsidered, looked at him with something like wonder that she was trying to be unsentimental about. "You've been doing this your whole life, haven't you? Watching. Working out the shape of things from limited information because the people around you didn't explain, and you had to figure it out yourself." Harry hadn't thought about it in those terms. He turned it over. "I suppose," he said. "That's a remarkable skill," she said. "Genuinely. It's also very sad." "Both things," he said. She nodded. "Both things." That evening, Amelia came to find him after dinner with the second folder under her arm and an expression that told him what was in it before she said a word. She sat down, and she told him about the prophecy. She told him all of it, the full text, which she had obtained through a combination of legal mandate and unspeakable cooperation that had taken her most of the previous night to arrange. She read it clearly, without softening, because that was the only way she knew how to give someone information that was theirs to have. He listened. When she finished, he sat for a while in the silence of a person who has just been handed the framework of someone else's plan for his life. "He knew," Harry said finally. "He knew what the prophecy said. He knew it meant I was going to have to deal with Voldemort. And he thought if I grew up not knowing who I was, not feeling entitled to power or strength or even enough food." He stopped. "He wanted me compliant. Small. Someone who'd do what he was told because he'd never been told he had a right to do anything else." Amelia was very still. "That's not—" she started, and he could see her wanting to offer a more charitable version. "I'm not saying he did it out of cruelty," Harry said. "I think he believed it. I think he genuinely thought a hero who knew his own strength would be too difficult to point in the right direction. He needed me to be useful. Not powerful. Useful." He looked at his hands. "The prophecy is why he put me in the cupboard. Not to protect me from Death Eaters. To make sure I stayed manageable until he needed me not to be." Amelia was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if I can prove that in a Wizengamot proceeding," she said honestly. "You don't have to prove the motivation," Harry said. "You've already proved the actions. The motivation is just—" He thought about it. "It's just for me. So I know what I'm looking at." She nodded slowly. Outside the window of his ministry room, London moved through its ordinary evening in total ignorance of what was being built in the old stone chamber beneath it. 3 days until the Wizengamot reconvened. 3 days in which Dumbledore would move his pieces across the board with the skill of a century of practice, calling in favors, shaping narratives, reaching out to every ally he had. 3 days in which Amelia Bones would methodically continue to build something that didn't require anyone's trust in her, just their willingness to look at evidence. And 3 days in which Harry Potter would learn everything he could about the world he'd been kept from, with a blackthorn wand and 2 friends and the cold, clear knowledge of exactly what he was dealing with. He went to bed that night with the prophecy in his memory, not frightening, not paralyzing. Just information. A thing that was true about his life that he now knew, which meant he could account for it, work with it, decide what it meant on his own terms rather than someone else's. Somewhere under Hogwarts, a three-headed dog was guarding a trapdoor. Harry didn't know about that yet. But he was beginning to learn that the things you didn't know yet were the most important ones to go looking for. Chapter 4. Sorting Storms. The Hogwarts Express left without him on September 1st, but it came back for him on September 4th. Not literally. What actually happened was that McGonagall sent a carriage from Hogsmeade to the Ministry's apparition point on the edge of London, driven by a wizard named Rosmerta's cousin who apparently did courier runs for the school and who said nothing beyond "hop in," and then spent the entire journey humming to himself in a way that suggested he'd been told not to ask questions. Harry sat with his trunk in Hedwig's cage and watched the English countryside transition from motorway grey to something greener and older, and felt the shift in the air as they moved north, a change in quality, like the world was deepening. Ron and Hermione were already at Hogwarts. Ron had gone back with his family on September 1st after extracting a promise from Harry that he would write immediately upon arrival. Hermione had gone back the same day after extracting a significantly more comprehensive promise involving a full report on the Wizengamot recess proceedings and Harry's personal assessment of the evidentiary strategy going forward. He'd written both letters last night. Ron's was 2 paragraphs and a drawing of a spider that he'd added because Ron had mentioned at some point hating spiders. Hermione's was 4 pages. The Wizengamot had issued its interim ruling that morning. Amelia had read it to him over breakfast with her controlled expression deployed at full strength, which meant the outcome was mixed in a way she felt strongly about but was not going to perform feeling strongly about in front of him. The interim ruling found sufficient evidence to proceed to full criminal hearing on 2 counts: failure to maintain legally required welfare oversight, and deliberate obstruction of the Platform 9 3/4 protective ward alert system. Dumbledore had been formally suspended from his position as Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards and removed from the Wizengamot itself, pending the full hearing. He retained, for now, his position as headmaster of Hogwarts. The Hogwarts Board of Governors had jurisdiction there, not the Ministry, and while 3 governors had already moved to suspend him, 4 others had moved just as quickly to block it. Which meant Harry was going to school with his alleged neglector still nominally in charge. He'd thought about this during breakfast and decided it was fine. He'd been managing hostile authority figures since he was old enough to understand that Uncle Vernon's moods followed patterns if you paid attention. Dumbledore was a significantly more sophisticated version of the problem, but the core competency was the same. Watch. Learn the patterns. Don't mistake the performance for the person underneath it. You could request a different arrangement, Amelia had said carefully, over toast. Temporary schooling at one of the No, Harry said. Hogwarts. She hadn't pushed. He was beginning to think she'd expected that answer. What had changed, as of this morning, was his guardianship. The Wizengamot's interim ruling included a formal guardianship order, temporary, pending the full hearing, granting legal magical guardianship to Amelia Bones. Harry was no longer, in any legal sense, under Dumbledore's jurisdiction. The Dursleys' rights had been formally suspended. A copy of the order was in his inner pocket, and he was obscurely comforted by its presence, the way you were comforted by a map in unfamiliar territory, not because you were lost, but because having the map meant you knew exactly where you stood. The carriage turned off the main road onto something older. He felt Hogwarts before he saw it. He felt it the way he'd felt the Platform 9 3/4 wards, a consciousness of something large and present, old magic that had been alive long enough to develop its own awareness. The feeling built as they crested the final hill and the castle came into view, and Harry leaned forward involuntarily because there it was, the thing he'd been reading about and imagining for a month, and no amount of imagination had quite got the scale right. It sat against the darkening afternoon sky with the comfortable solidity of something that knew it had been there for 1,000 years and planned to be there for 1,000 more. "All right?" said Rosmerta's cousin, glancing back. "Yeah," Harry said. He settled back. Just looking. The carriage deposited him at the main gates, where Professor McGonagall was waiting. In person she was everything the letter had suggested and also more, taller, sharper, with a quality of attention that made Harry feel that she saw considerably more than she commented on. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite the one she'd worn in the Wizengamot chamber, more unguarded than that, and then she said briskly, "Welcome to Hogwarts, Mr. Potter. I'll escort you to the Great Hall. The sorting is this evening. The other first years arrived 3 days ago and have been housed temporarily in the guest dormitories." "How do they know which house they're in?" Harry asked, moving alongside her through the gates. "They don't yet," she said. "They arrived with you in mind." She glanced at him sideways. "The hat sorts the students when it chooses. It chose to wait." Harry processed this. "The hat waited for me?" "The hat," she said with the careful tone of someone discussing a personality they find both indispensable and occasionally exasperating, "has opinions. This is not the strangest thing it's ever done." "What's the strangest thing it's ever done?" She almost smiled. "It once sorted a student by singing an original ballad about them first. 37 verses. We were there for 2 hours. She paused. She turned out to be a very interesting person. They walked through the entrance hall, enormous stone, with a warmth in it that wasn't entirely temperature, and Harry felt the castle paying attention to him the way the wards had paid attention, old and curious and entirely without agenda. He was beginning to think that the things in the wizarding world he trusted most were the old ones, the ones built before institutional politics had had time to layer over everything. McGonagall stopped him at the doors to the Great Hall. She turned to face him fully, which was different from the brisk purposefulness of the past few minutes. "I want to say something before you go in," she said. He waited. "What you did in that chamber," she said, "was correct and it was brave. What it was not was easy, and the reverberations from it are not going to stop at the ministry's door. There will be people in that hall tonight who have opinions about this case, staff and students. Some of those opinions will be about you specifically." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that you have my support. Completely, without condition, and entirely independently of whatever the headmaster's office may communicate to the contrary." "He's still in the school," Harry said. "He is." Her jaw was set. "The board has not yet reached consensus. Until they do, my position is to ensure that the legal guardianship order is honored in full, that you are safe, and that any attempt to use his position to access or influence you outside formal channels is reported to Madame Bones immediately." She paused. "And Mr. Potter, if he approaches you directly, in any context, you come to me first. Not after. First." "Understood," Harry said. She nodded once, and it was a nod between equals rather than a dismissal. Then she pushed the great hall doors open, and Harry walked in. He had thought, walking in 3 days late, that he might be able to be quiet about it. Enter somewhere in the middle, find a seat, manage the attention gradually. He'd thought this, he reflected, with remarkably poor analytical thinking, because he was Harry Potter and the room had 400 people in it who had been waiting 3 days for this specific moment. The silence was instantaneous and total. 4 long tables, each lined with students in house robes. A staff table at the far end where the teachers sat. Hundreds of candles floating at various heights. And every single face in the room turning toward the doors at the same moment, like a field of flowers tracking the sun. He walked in. He made a decision about this moment, which was that he was not going to perform smallness. He was not going to duck his head, or hunch his shoulders, or execute any of the 1,000 small movements he'd spent 10 years perfecting as ways to take up less space and draw less attention. He was done with that particular skill set. He walked across the great hall at a pace that was unhurried and direct, and he kept his expression neutral and his chin level, and he thought about the old magic in the walls and let it be company. He found Ron at the Gryffindor table. Ron was the easiest person in the room to find because he was standing slightly, not quite standing but halfway off his seat, waving in a way that was trying to be subtle and completely wasn't. Harry caught his eye, and Ron grinned, wide and uncomplicated and entirely sincere, and Harry felt something in his chest ease slightly. He looked across to the next table and found Hermione, who gave him a single firm nod in the manner of someone confirming a plan was going well, which was so precisely Hermione that he almost smiled. And then there was a boy at the Gryffindor table a few seats from Ron who was looking at Harry with wide eyes and the expression of someone who had thought about what to do if Harry Potter was real and arriving at Hogwarts, and had still not come up with a sufficient plan, round-faced, sandy-haired, with an air of desperate hopefulness that Harry recognized in himself from a long time ago and felt something immediate about. He'd find out later the boy was Neville Longbottom, who had been sorted into Gryffindor 3 days ago by a hat that had taken an unusually long time about it, and who had spent those 3 days being told by various sources that he probably shouldn't be there. McGonagall's voice cut through the room's noise with the precision of someone who had spent decades managing large groups of students. "If you'll settle, please," she said, and the room settled. She moved to the front of the room, where a 3-legged stool waited with a very old, very battered-looking hat sitting on top of it. The hat, as Harry approached, did something unexpected. It turned to face him. "Sit down," it said in a voice that sounded like pages turning, like stone on stone, like the very oldest layers of the castle speaking through its most battered ambassador. It did not wait for him to sit before continuing. "I've been looking forward to this." "You waited," Harry said, sitting. "Of course I waited." "Do you know how long it's been since I've had someone actually interesting to sort?" It sounded, against all reason, pleased. 3 days of lovely children, all of them quite clear-cut. You're the first one this year who's made me think. "What are you thinking about?" Harry asked. In the hall behind him, he could feel 400 people sitting in perfect silence. He kept his attention on the hat, which seemed to appreciate it. "You," the hat said. "About what you are and what you've made of it. You know, I can see everything in here." It settled slightly on his head, the way hats did when they were getting comfortable. "Everything they did to you. Everything you built in spite of it. You've got quite the collection of qualities, Mr. Potter. All 4 houses could make an argument. Which one's right?" "That," the hat said, "is exactly the right question. The wrong question would be which one is best. You didn't ask that." It paused. "You'd have been a Slytherin, you know, in another life. The strategic mind, the self-reliance, the ability to read a room that most adults can't manage. Completely at home there. But not this life," Harry said. "No. Because Slytherin would teach you to use those things for yourself, and you're not." It seemed to search for the word. "Not oriented that way. You don't want to win. You want the thing that was wrong to be made right. That's a distinction that matters." Another pause, and he could feel the hat doing something that felt like reading, not thoughts exactly, more like the shape of thoughts, the pattern of how he moved through the world. "Ravenclaw could use your mind. Hufflepuff your loyalty. But the house that will serve the work you're actually going to do, Gryffindor," Harry said. "Gryffindor," the hat agreed. "Not because you're brave, though you are, in the specific way that people are brave when they've never been allowed to be anything else. But because Gryffindor will give you the thing you most need." "What's that?" "A room full of people who choose to stand next to the fire," the hat said, instead of stepping back from it. Then it raised its voice, the page's turning voice now pitched to carry to every corner of the great hall. "Gryffindor." The table to Harry's right erupted. The sound hit him like something physical, not just the applause, but the quality of it, the specific noise of 400 people who had been holding their breath releasing it at once. He settled the hat back on the stool and turned and looked at the Gryffindor table, where Ron was standing fully now and clapping with his whole body, and next to him the sandy-haired boy, Neville, was clapping too, looking startled by his own enthusiasm. He sat down next to Ron, and Ron thumped him on the back in the way of someone who had been waiting 3 days to do exactly that. "Took the hat long enough," Ron said. "It had things to say." "They always have things to say, but never that many things. Fred says the record is 11 minutes and this was definitely 4. Harry said. "That's still a lot." Across the hall, at the Slytherin table, Harry noted a pale blonde boy watching him with an expression that was calculating rather than hostile, assessing, the way you assess something that had arrived and changed the landscape. He'd find out later that was Draco Malfoy, who had wanted to be Harry's friend on the train and hadn't had the chance, and whose father had sent 3 owls to the Malfoy family solicitor this morning regarding the Wisengamot proceedings. The calculation in Malfoy's expression was not simple. Harry filed it. At the staff table, Dumbledore sat in the headmaster's chair and looked out over the hall with the serenity that was his default public expression, still present, still commanding, slightly more conscious than usual. He was watching Harry with the look of someone engaged in a long game recalibration. Harry caught the look without making it obvious that he caught it, which was a skill he'd been practicing without knowing what it was called. Next to Dumbledore, a man Harry didn't know was watching him with an intensity that was different in quality, sharp and slightly strained, like someone holding something painful still. He was pale, dark-haired, with a face that looked like it had never been young. This would turn out to be Severus Snape, Potions Master, and the quality of his attention in that moment was something Harry would think about later, when he understood more of the man's history. McGonagall sat at Dumbledore's other side with the expression of a woman who had chosen her position in a complex room very deliberately. The feast appeared. Harry had read about the feast in Hogwarts, a history, but reading about quantities of food when you are chronically underfed is a different experience from sitting in front of said quantities in person. He ate with the same careful methodology as on the train, systematically, making sure he actually tasted things, the nutritive drafts from Healer Cavendish doing something measurable to his appetite that he found quietly remarkable. Ron ate with the comfortable abundance of someone who had never had reason to think carefully about food, which Harry found he didn't resent at all. It was good to be next to someone for whom food was just food. Neville, who ended up on Harry's other side with the slightly surprised air of someone who hadn't expected to be included, started talking about herbology 20 minutes into the feast with the specific passion of a person who has found the one thing they're genuinely good at and isn't yet sure anyone else will think it matters. Harry asked him 3 questions about magical plants, genuinely, because he actually wanted to know, and Neville's expression did something remarkable, opened, somehow, like a window that had been painted shut and someone had finally run a knife around the frame. "You're actually interested," Neville said like he was checking. "Plants that do things," Harry said. "That's interesting. Most people just think it's boring. Most people are wrong about a lot of things," Harry said. Ron, who was on his 4th bread roll, leaned over and said to Neville, "He's like this. Just go with it." The first lesson that went wrong was potions. Not because Harry did anything wrong, that was the interesting part of it. The lesson went wrong because Snape walked into the dungeon classroom and looked at his students with the specific attention of a man running a private internal tribunal, and he stopped at Harry's desk and looked at him in a way that lasted 1 beat too long, and contained several things Harry couldn't immediately parse. Then he began to take the register. "Potter," he said, reaching Harry's name. "Here," Harry said. A pause. Not the pause of a man about to move on. The pause of a man choosing his next words from a large and specific inventory. "Our new celebrity," Snape said in a voice that was quiet and very precise in its contempt. "Tell me, Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The class went still with the specific stillness of people watching something they're not sure about. Harry looked at Snape. He was aware of what this was, the performance of it, the way the question was designed to establish a dynamic in front of witnesses, the assumption buried in the phrasing that our new celebrity would not know and would therefore be established as appropriately humble in front of his classmates. He answered the question. "Draught of living death," he said. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. The asphodel and wormwood are the foundation. You need to refine the process significantly to produce anything stable, but that's the base." He held Snape's gaze. "The name is interesting. It's technically a suspension rather than a genuine metabolic death state, which is why revival is possible with the right counterdraught." Silence. Snape looked at him with an expression that had shifted in a way Harry found difficult to read but filed carefully. "What did you read that?" Snape said, the quiet precision of his voice unchanged but something underneath it recalibrating. "Magical drafts and potions," Harry said. "And the advanced potions reference in the Hogwarts library. I've had a few days. The advanced reference is not on the first-year reading list." "I know." Another pause. The class was very attentive. "Bezoar," Snape said. "What is it, and what does it do?" "Stone found in the stomach of a goat. Antidote to most poisons." Harry paused. "You can also use it as a base component in more complex antidotal potions. The Bezoar's magical neutralizing properties react differently with prepared potions than with raw ingested toxins." Snape was still for a moment. "Monkshood," he said. "Wolfsbane. Aconite. All the same plant. Dangerous, highly toxic. Useful in Wolfsbane potion in controlled doses." He paused. "The brewing process for Wolfsbane is apparently one of the most technically demanding potions in existence. I haven't read enough about it yet to discuss it properly." The yet landed in the room with a soft specificity. Snape looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not what Harry had expected from the opening of this exchange. It had started as contempt adjacent. It was now something else. Something that had been wrong-footed and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. 5 points to Gryffindor," Snape said in the tone of a man for whom those words caused physical discomfort. He moved on. At the bench next to Harry, Neville made a small sound that might have been suppressed surprise. Harry opened his potions book and found his page. Ron caught him on the way out of potions and said, very quietly, "Nobody's ever made Snape give Gryffindor points. My brother said he never has. In 7 years of their being here. There's a first time for everything," Harry said. "Fred is going to lose his mind," Ron said with deep satisfaction. Defense against the dark arts was different. Professor Quirrell taught it, a slight nervous man in a remarkable purple turban, and the classroom smelled wrong in a way Harry couldn't immediately identify. Underneath the incense someone had clearly tried to cover it with something chemical and old and deeply unpleasant. He noticed it the moment he walked in and said nothing, but he sat in the back row without planning to and spent the lesson watching Quirrell instead of listening to what he was saying. Quirrell stuttered badly and apologized for it in a way that seemed slightly performed, and his teaching was disorganized in the way that was either nerves or something else, and Harry kept his attention on him throughout the class while appearing to take notes. He couldn't name yet what was wrong. But something was wrong, and he was very good at knowing when something was wrong even when he couldn't yet say what. After the class he mentioned it to Hermione in the corridor. She frowned immediately. "Define wrong." "The smell," Harry said. "Underneath the incense. Something chemical. And the turban, it's not just nerves." He was nervous about something specific. He kept not looking at the back of the classroom. Hermione considered this. "I noticed the not looking," she said. "I thought it was just the layout." He looked at every other part of the room. "Not the back." "I'll find something to read," she said, which was Hermione, for I will address this comprehensively. "Don't be obvious about it," Harry said. She gave him the expression of someone mildly offended by the implication. "I am never obvious about research. You took 4 pages of notes in a 1-hour class. That's thorough, not obvious." Neville, who had fallen into the habit of walking with them between classes with the slightly tentative air of someone not quite sure he was allowed to, said quietly, "I noticed the smell too. It reminded me of something my gran grows in the back garden. Something she says is very dangerous if it's not contained." Harry looked at him. "What plant?" "I don't know the name off the top of my head," Neville said, with the focus of someone pulling at a memory. "But the smell, it's a dark magic-adjacent plant. Gran keeps it locked up." "Can you write to her?" Harry asked. Neville blinked, clearly not having expected to be consulted on something actually useful. "Yes," he said, with a new quality in his voice. "Yes, I can do that." The first week settled into a rhythm. Mornings, classes, where Harry discovered that the magic coming through the Blackthorn wand was everything Healer Cavendish had suggested, and then considerably more. Not showy, he wasn't interested in showy, but consistent and precise in a way that was becoming visible to his teachers. Flitwick gave him a charm to practice in the first charms lesson, and he had it on the second try, and Flitwick made a sound that was something between delight and scientific fascination. Transfiguration, which McGonagall taught with the rigor of a woman who respected the subject too much to accept sloppiness in it, was where Harry's precision was most apparent, the ability to hold the image of the intended transformation absolutely steady in mind while executing the wand motion, which he was beginning to understand was the hardest part for most students, came to him almost naturally. He suspected the hat had been right about what 10 years of inward magic had built. Evenings, the library with Hermione, or the common room with Ron and Neville, or sometimes just the corridor near the room on the 7th floor that seemed to shift when you were paying attention to it, which he'd found by accident on the 3rd day and had filed for later investigation. And once, on the 5th day, an envelope under his door. No owl. Just there, in the morning, the distinctive blue ink handwriting on plain parchment. Harry, I know that what I ask of you in this moment is significant, and I know you have little reason to grant it. Nevertheless, I am asking. 5 minutes. In my office. No intermediaries, no formal record. Just a conversation. There is something you need to understand about yourself that is easier shown than proven in a Wizengamot chamber. Albus Dumbledore. Harry read it twice, folded it, and went to McGonagall's office before breakfast. She read it without speaking. Then she looked up at him. No, she said simply. That was my answer too, Harry said. But I wanted to tell you it arrived. She held his gaze. You understand what he's doing? Trying to get me alone before the full hearing, Harry said. Without witnesses. He wants to tell me about the prophecy in a context he controls. He doesn't know you already know. No, Harry said. And I'd rather keep it that way for now. McGonagall looked at him with the expression she'd worn in the Wizengamot chamber when she'd said I should have done more than tell him, the expression of someone who was revising what they thought was required of them. I'll report the contact to Madame Bones, she said. Thank you, Harry said. He went to breakfast. Neville had saved him a seat, which had become a thing that happened. He sat down and Neville pushed the toast rack toward him without commentary, and Harry poured himself tea and thought about Dumbledore's letter and the phrase easier shown than proven. The prophecy, probably. The prophecy about Voldemort, who wasn't dead. Harry had been fairly certain of this since reading about the events of October 1981, since a killing curse that almost worked and left a scar seemed to him to suggest something incomplete rather than finished. And if Voldemort wasn't dead, and if Dumbledore planned to use Harry to deal with him eventually, then easier shown than proven probably meant something practical. Something related to Harry's power, his connection to Voldemort, something that would be designed to make Harry feel the weight of his own necessity, and therefore more inclined to cooperate. He was thinking about this when Ron sat down across from him and said, "Letter from Mum," with a slightly careful expression. Harry looked up. She's still. Ron paused, choosing the word. Concerned. About the hearing. About you being here while the headmaster is, you know. She's not wrong that it's complicated, she just... He stopped again. She loves Dumbledore the way my dad loves the Chudley Cannons. It's not entirely rational. What do you want me to do with that? Harry said, genuinely asking. Nothing, Ron said. I'm just being honest. He opened the letter and turned it over so Harry could see the postscript at the bottom, which read, in clearly anxious handwriting, "Please tell Harry he's welcome for Christmas if things are still unsettled. The room is always there." Harry read it. She means it, Ron said. Even worrying about Dumbledore, she means it. That's just Mum. Harry folded the letter back and handed it to Ron and thought about someone leaving a room available even when they were uncertain about the situation, and about how complicated people were, and how that didn't have to be a reason not to trust the parts that were trustworthy. Tell her thank you, he said. Ron nodded and ate his eggs. It was Snape who surprised him. 8 days in, Harry was in the library late. Hermione had gone back to the common room an hour ago, and Harry had stayed because he'd found a section on magical core theory that connected to something Healer Cavendish had said, and he wanted to finish the thread. The library was nearly empty. The candles were burning low in the way that suggested the hour was getting significant. Snape appeared between the stacks with the quality of movement of someone who had been quiet in difficult environments for a very long time, and knew how to be in a room before you noticed him. Harry noticed him. He looked up from the book and said nothing, which seemed to catch Snape slightly off balance, the implicit expectation having been that Harry would startle. Snape looked at the book on the table. Advanced Magical Core Theory, Constraint and Expression, which was not a library book for first years and which Harry had found by asking the library's magical catalog system in very specific terms. You read quickly, Snape said. I have a lot of time to make up, Harry said. A pause. Snape moved forward and looked at the book, not at Harry, at the book, with the expression of someone who has read the same text and is thinking about what it means that someone else is reading it now. Your potions work this week, Snape said. Has been. He stopped. Acceptable? Harry offered. Above acceptable. The words cost him something, which Harry could see. Your theoretical understanding outpaces your practical technique, which is the reverse of most students. Most students can follow procedure without understanding why the procedure works. You understand why and are still building the physical habit of execution. I know, Harry said. Hermione's the same. She understands the theory faster than I do in most subjects, but she practices the technical execution more systematically. He paused. I learned from watching her. Snape looked at him with the specific expression of a man being made to revise a position he'd been comfortable in. You came here intending to be a serious student, he said, and it was not a question. I came here intending to learn everything I possibly could as fast as possible, Harry said. Given that I started late. The constraint, Snape said, and something in his voice was different, quieter, less armored. The core suppression. You read the healer's report? I was told about it. The circumstances. At your relatives. He said it without his usual precision, the words slightly less controlled than his normal delivery. I taught your mother, he said. Lily Evans. Exceptional witch. Gifted beyond what her training should have produced, because her magic understood her in a way most people's doesn't. He stopped. You have her quality in it. I noticed it in the potions classroom. The magic knows what you mean. Harry looked at him. Snape appeared to become aware that he had said more than he'd intended. His expression locked back down. You should not be in the library this late, he said, returning to his normal register. 5 points from Gryffindor. He was gone between the stacks before Harry could respond. Harry sat for a moment, looking at the space where he'd been. Then he wrote Lily Evans in his notebook and underlined it. On the 9th day, Neville's letter came back from his grandmother. He brought it to breakfast with an expression that was somewhere between excited and apprehensive, the face of someone who has found information and isn't sure if finding it is good. He put it on the table between himself and Harry. The plant, he said. Gran knew it immediately. She says it's called black wraith's tongue. It's not native to Britain. It grows in Eastern European mountain regions, and it's been banned from import since 1965. He paused. She says the smell it produces is almost identical to, well. He looked at Harry. She says it's often used as a carrier. A component in containment solutions for dark magical entities. Things that can't survive in open air. Harry looked at the letter. Something in that turban, he said. Grant says the smell would persist if you were in close contact with something that required that kind of solution to be stable. Neville's voice was careful. She says she doesn't want to know what I'm asking for. Harry folded the letter and passed it to Hermione, who had appeared at his elbow in the way she sometimes did when she sensed relevant information was nearby. She read it. Her face went very still. "We need to tell McGonagall," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "And Madam Bones?" she added. "Yes," he said again. They looked at each other, and then both of them looked at the staff table, where Quirrell was eating breakfast with the slightly disconnected manner of someone whose attention was not quite in the room. He was not looking at the back of the hall. "Not yet," Harry said, though he wasn't sure yet what yet was waiting for. "Let's find out what's under the school first." "Under the school," Hermione repeated. "There's something being guarded," Harry said. "I've heard things in the corridors at night. A dog, three-headed based on the sound, on the third floor where we're told not to go. And Quirrell, who is carrying something in that turban that needs a dark containment solution." He looked at her. "These things are related." Hermione processed this for a moment. "We need more information before we do anything." "Obviously," Harry said. Yes," Harry said. "Whatever you were about to say, yes, look into it." She smiled, very briefly, the smile of someone engaged in the thing they were born to do. Across the hall, Dumbledore was watching the three of them with an expression that had departed entirely from serenity and arrived at something more specific: concern, real concern, the kind you felt when a plan you'd spent a decade constructing started showing variable behavior in its central component. Harry didn't look at him. He ate his breakfast and thought about what was under Hogwarts, and what it was worth protecting, and what it would mean if Quirrell, nervous, stuttering Quirrell with his wrong-smelling turban, was the person trying to get to it. And in his inner pocket, the guardianship order crinkled slightly when he moved, and he found it comforting, the same as always, because it said clearly and legally and without possibility of misinterpretation who was responsible for him. Not Dumbledore. Not the Dursleys. Him. With a chosen adult to answer to rather than an appointed one. Which was, he was beginning to understand, the difference between a cage with a roof and an open sky with someone standing at the edge of it, ready to catch you if you needed it but not there to limit where you flew. Chapter 5. The Evidence and the Enemy. The full Wizengamot hearing resumed on a Thursday. Harry knew it was Thursday because Hermione had written it in the margins of his charms notes the week before with a small arrow and the word significant, which was the kind of thing Hermione did without thinking about it, annotating the world for the benefit of people near her. He knew it was significant because Amelia had written to him twice in the preceding days, letters that were informational in content, and warm in tone in the specific way of someone who had become genuinely invested in an outcome while maintaining the professional architecture of their relationship. The second letter had ended with, "Whatever happens Thursday, you've already won the only part that matters. The record exists. It cannot be unmade." He'd read that 3 times and then tucked it behind the others in the inner pocket where the guardianship order lived. McGonagall excused him from Thursday's classes with a note that said family matter in her precise handwriting, which Harry thought was technically accurate in the complicated way that the truth could be accurate, and still contain multitudes. He took the ministry carriage from Hogsmeade at 7 in the morning with Ron, who had simply announced he was coming, and Hermione, who had prepared a 4-point briefing document on likely Wizengamot procedural developments, and Neville, who had not been invited but had been standing at the carriage with his bag when Harry arrived and had said, with the quiet determination that was his emerging mode, "I'd like to come, if that's all right." Harry had looked at him. "Your Gran will be fine with it?" he asked. "She'll be furious," Neville said. "But she'll understand." A pause. "She came around on you quite a bit after I told her about the Quirrell information. She said anyone who asked the right questions was worth standing next to." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Harry said. Neville seemed surprised by this, in the way he was still getting used to being found worthwhile. "She is," he said with a new kind of pride. "She really is." So there were 4 of them in the carriage, which was slightly crowded and entirely fine, and Hermione gave her briefing document to Harry on the way and talked through it while Ron looked out the window and occasionally asked questions that were better than they sounded, and Neville followed the legal analysis with focused attention and twice caught implications that Hermione had to concede were valid. The key developments, as Hermione had synthesized them, Amelia had filed 3 new pieces of evidence in the preceding week. First, a record of communications between Dumbledore and the Hogwarts Board of Governors in 1982, in which Dumbledore had described Harry as settling well into his placement, a description he could not have made without visiting, and a visit he had never officially recorded. Second, a financial audit showing that a trust vault at Gringotts, established by Lily and James Potter for Harry's upkeep, had been drawn on quarterly by a ministry standing order, the money routed not to the Dursleys but to an account registered to the Hogwarts headmaster's discretionary fund. Third, and this was the one that had made Harry sit very still when he'd read Amelia's letter, a record from St. Mungo's of a consultation in 1982, under a privacy seal that the DMLE had broken via warrant, in which Dumbledore had requested an assessment of the long-term developmental effects of minimal social and nutritional provision on a child with an active magical core. He'd asked a healer. He'd asked whether doing it would cause permanent damage. The healer had said, in documented notes that now sat in Amelia's file, that it would cause significant developmental impacts on magical core expression and emotional regulation, but would be unlikely to cause permanent core damage if corrected before adolescence. Dumbledore had thanked the healer and left. And then done it anyway. He knew, Hermione said, and her voice was very controlled. He knew exactly what he was doing and the potential consequences, and he made an informed decision. Harry looked out the carriage window at the countryside. Yeah, he said. That changes the legal category, she said. It moves from negligent oversight to deliberate calculated harm. The intent element is, I know, Harry said. She stopped. Looked at him. Are you all right? He thought about the question the way he'd learned to think about it, not dismissively, actually sitting with it for a moment. I'm not surprised, he said. That's the thing. I read that and I wasn't surprised. Which tells me something about what I've always known at some level that I couldn't articulate yet. That doesn't make it less awful, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Ron, without turning from the window, said, When this is over, I'm going to eat an enormous amount of food in your honor. Harry looked at him. In solidarity, Ron clarified, turning around. Enormous and deliberate. Every meal. Forever. Harry almost laughed. It was a near thing. That's your plan. It's a very sincere plan, Ron said with complete dignity. Harry did laugh, then, which was not what he'd expected to do this morning, and Neville smiled, and Hermione looked at Ron with the expression she wore when he did something that surprised her into appreciation. The Wisengamot chamber was fuller than last time. Harry noticed it before he reached the gallery. The press contingent had doubled, the quick quotes quills multiplying along the upper tiers like reeds in a pond. He noted several names on press identification badges. The Prophet's senior correspondent, 2 names from abroad, Le Monde Magique and the Magical Observer out of New York, and Rita Skeeter, who was in a vivid teal set of robes and watching everything with the bright-eyed attention of someone who had decided this was the most important story of the decade and planned to personally extract every drop of it. The 4 of them settled in the observer's gallery. Kingsley was already there, broad and immovable, and he nodded at Harry as they took their seats. Amelia was at her table with 3 files and the stillness of someone who has prepared so thoroughly that preparation has become serenity, different from Dumbledore's serenity, which was performance. This was the kind that came from knowing exactly where every piece was and trusting the structure. Dumbledore entered, and today was different again. He had adjusted once more, the robes were plainer, the manner quieter, something about him deployed with the careful deliberation of someone who had understood overnight that serenity had not been sufficient, and was trying something else. He looked, today, like a man who was tired and genuinely sorry. It was a better performance than the previous ones, and Harry recognized it as better precisely because it contained real elements. Dumbledore was tired, probably, and he was genuinely sorry for certain things, just not the things that mattered most. He sat. His counsel, Greengrass, arranged papers with a focus that communicated professional concern he was trying not to show. Cornelius Fudge was not present today. Harry noted this. The chief warlock opened proceedings and Amelia rose immediately. I wish to present 3 additional pieces of evidence before the Wizengamot today, she said, which were obtained by warrant in the preceding week and which bear directly on the question of intent. Greengrass rose. The defense objects to any evidence obtained under the warrants were issued by Wizengamot authority and are fully in order, Amelia said without looking at him. She was looking at the chief warlock. I have the documentation here. The chief warlock reviewed the paperwork and nodded. Greengrass sat down with the expression of someone calculating and not liking the results. She presented the 3 pieces of evidence in the same order she described them to Harry: the Board of Governors communication, the financial audit, and the St. Mungo's consultation. She presented them with the methodical patience of someone building something weight-bearing, laying each stone level before placing the next. The chamber's quality of silence changed with each one. The financial audit made the Wizengamot stir. Money, Harry had noticed, made people pay a specific kind of attention that the physical evidence of harm did not always reach. Potter family money, designated for Harry's care, routed to a discretionary fund. Numbers were concrete in a way that the description of a cupboard was not, for people who had been listening to many descriptions over many proceedings. But the St. Mungo's consultation made the room go absolutely still. Amelia read the relevant section of the healer's notes aloud. Her voice was level and unhurried. Significant developmental impacts on magical core expression and emotional regulation. Unlikely to cause permanent core damage if corrected before adolescence. She let it sit. The respondent, she said, sought expert medical opinion on the potential consequences of his intended course of action. He received a documented assessment indicating those consequences would be significant. He proceeded with that course of action for 9 additional years. She closed the file. This is not oversight. It is not wartime error of judgment. This is an informed, deliberate choice to constrain the development of a child in ways the respondent had been told would cause significant harm, in service of an outcome the respondent desired, specifically, a child whose sense of self and personal power were diminished enough to make him reliably cooperative when his cooperation was required. The chamber was very, very quiet. In the gallery, Neville had gone slightly pale. Ron's jaw was tight. Hermione was not taking notes, which meant the feeling was too much for the buffer of documentation. Dumbledore sat very still. Then he rose, and Greengrass half rose to touch his arm, and Dumbledore looked at his counsel with something in his face that Harry could see even from the gallery, a decision being made, something being set down. Let me speak, Dumbledore said to Greengrass quietly. And then, to the chief warlock. I would like to address the chamber directly. Without notes. Without council's mediation. The chief warlock looked at Greengrass, who sat down with the expression of a professional who has been overruled and knows it. The floor is yours, Professor Dumbledore, the chief warlock said. Dumbledore stood for a moment in the silence. I have spent a great many years, he said, being right about things. This is not self-aggrandizement, it is relevant context. When you have been right about things as consistently as I have been, it becomes increasingly difficult to entertain the possibility that you might be wrong about something significant. The mechanisms you build for hearing dissent atrophy. Minerva told me the placement was wrong. A healer told me the effects would be harmful. The wards, built by a woman considerably wiser than I in the specific wisdom of protecting children, tried to tell me every year. He paused. I found reasons. For all of it. I found reasons because I needed the outcome I had planned, and I still have, I think, some fundamental confusion between having planned something thoroughly and having planned it correctly. The chamber listened. The prophecy, Dumbledore said, and felt the room shift, concerns a child who must face Voldemort, whose survival and ultimate victory depends on certain qualities that I genuinely believed, required a specific kind of formation. A child who knew his own power too early, who felt entitled to the world's attention and resources, who was formed in comfort and assurance. He stopped. I thought that child could not make the sacrifice, when the sacrifice was asked of him. His voice was quieter now, something underneath the performance that was the real thing. I was working from the wrong premise. I believed the sacrifice was inevitable, and that Harry needed to be shaped toward it. I did not consider. Another pause. That a child who knew he was valued might make a chosen sacrifice rather than an extracted one. That a willing act of courage has always been more powerful than a martyrdom engineered through deprivation. He looked up at the gallery. Harry looked back at him. I was wrong, Dumbledore said to the chamber, and Harry understood to him. About the method. About the premise. About the nature of what I was doing to a child who deserved better from everyone who was supposed to protect him. He looked down at his hands. I cannot make restitution for 10 years. I can only say that clearly, in a room with a record being made, which is what Harry asked for. And tell you that the evidence against me is accurate. The silence lasted a full 10 seconds. Then Griselda Marchbanks spoke, in her clear, sharp voice. What is the nature of this prophecy? And on whose authority did you decide it gave you the right to harm a child? And Dumbledore told them. He told them the full text, the words that had been recorded in the Department of Mysteries and had shaped 11 years of decisions, and the room absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, with the particular weight of people who understood the implications and were going to have to live in the world those implications described. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for either can live while the other survives. Harry, in the gallery, listened to words he'd already heard from Amelia's voice and felt the same thing he'd felt then, not fear, not the weight of inevitability. The same cold clarity. A thing that was true, that he now fully knew, that he could account for. He also felt, more strongly than he'd expected, something else. Something that was almost like anger, clean and specific, not at the prophecy itself, but at what had been done in its name. The prophecy said he had power that Voldemort didn't know. Dumbledore, who knew about this power, had spent 10 years systematically ensuring that Harry himself also didn't know about it. He'd been diminished in the name of a prophecy about his own strength. He sat with that. Then he turned to Hermione, who was watching the chamber floor with an expression of concentrated thought. The prophecy says power Voldemort knows not, he said quietly. Not power Harry knows not. She turned to look at him. He was keeping me small, Harry said, to protect a strategic asset. But the prophecy doesn't require me to be small. It just says the power exists. He paused. Which means the entire premise of the plan was based on a misreading. Hermione stared at him. The sacrifice element, he continued, keeping his voice low, is about love. The prophecy doesn't specify how it works. It just says Voldemort will be defeated. Dumbledore assumed a specific mechanism, a martyrdom, and built 10 years of strategy around an assumption that isn't in the text. He overdetermined the prophecy, Hermione said, with the slightly stunned quality of someone whose very capable brain has just been asked to run at full speed. He decided what it meant instead of letting it be ambiguous, and then acted as if his interpretation was the only possible one. Yes, Harry said. She looked at the chamber floor, where Dumbledore was still speaking, and something moved across her face that was several feelings at once. That's very human, she said. And very catastrophic. Both things, Harry said. The Wizengamot deliberated for 2 hours. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville found a small anteroom off the main corridor and sat in it with tea that someone had conjured and a silence that was comfortable in the way silences were comfortable between people who had established that they didn't need to fill every space. Ron drank his tea and said eventually, "That thing he said? About the sacrifice being extracted rather than chosen." He turned his cup in his hands. That was him admitting it out loud. That he'd planned to use you. Yes, Harry said. Does that? Ron looked at him. How does that sit with you? Actually, Harry thought about it properly, Because Ron was asking properly and deserved a proper answer. It sits strangely, he said. Because he's not evil. That's the part that's hard to explain. He believed in what he was doing. He thought he was right. He paused. The people who've hurt me in my life have mostly believed they were right. Uncle Vernon thought I was a problem that needed managing. Dumbledore thought I was a resource that needed shaping. Neither of them were thinking about me as a person. Someone with my own interior. He stopped. That's the thing that's hardest to name. It's not the specific injuries. It's being treated as a means to someone else's end for 11 years and never having the language for it. The room was quiet. Neville said unexpectedly, "My family did something like that." He was looking at his tea. "Not the same, nothing like what happened to you. But after my parents, my gran was so focused on making sure I was a Longbottom, a proper wizarding family heir, that she sort of..." He stopped. "She forgot to ask what I wanted. She forgot to see what I was actually good at, and just kept pushing on what she thought I should be." He looked up. "I don't think she's a bad person. I think she was scared and she managed the fear by controlling what she could control." Harry looked at him. "That's very perceptive," Hermione said gently. "Gran would say I shouldn't be so understanding about it," Neville said, with a slight curve of his mouth. "She'd say Longbottoms don't psychoanalyze, they act." "What do you say?" Harry asked. "I say understanding it is how you act on it properly," Neville said. He looked at Harry steadily. "You're not going to become him. You know that, right? Knowing all this, the prophecy, the plan, all of it, you're not going to become someone who manages people toward outcomes." Harry looked at him. "Is that what you think I need to hear?" "I think it's what I'd need to hear," Neville said simply. "In your position." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, "No," he said. "I'm not going to become him. Not because I'm better than him, I don't know that. But because I've seen what it produces and I want no part of it." Neville nodded and went back to his tea. Ron looked at Neville with the expression of someone who has just seen a friend do something that re-ranked them in his estimation. Hermione wrote something in her notebook, small and private, that she didn't show to anyone. Kingsley appeared in the doorway 2 hours and 15 minutes after they'd left the chamber. "Ruling's ready," he said. The chief warlock read it standing. 2 criminal findings. Guilty on the charge of deliberate obstruction of the Platform 9 3/4 ward alert system, a Category 1 magical obstruction offense. Guilty on the charge of deliberate harmful misuse of guardianship authority, in the knowledge that said misuse would cause significant developmental harm to the child in question. The penalties were, and Harry listened carefully, because this was the part that would tell him what the system was willing to do to one of its own. Dumbledore was stripped of his Supreme Mugwump position permanently. His Wisengamot membership was revoked and barred for life. A fine of 30,000 galleons, payable to the Potter Family Trust. And his position as headmaster of Hogwarts was referred to the Board of Governors for mandatory review with a DMLE recommendation of removal. Not Azkaban. Harry had expected this and had prepared for it. The system protected itself to a point. Dumbledore was too embedded, too necessary to too many people, had done too much genuine good alongside the harm for a custodial sentence to make it through the chamber. He watched the reading of the ruling with this knowledge already in place, and felt the space between what justice looked like in principle and what it looked like in practice. Still, it was more than nothing. It was considerably more than nothing. At the respondents' table, Dumbledore sat with his hands folded and received the ruling with the stillness of someone who had known what was coming and had decided to receive it without performance. Greengrass was writing rapidly beside him. Dumbledore did not look at anything in particular. Then he looked up at the gallery. Harry looked back. Dumbledore gave a slow, slight nod. The kind that acknowledged something real, without trying to make it into more than it was. Harry didn't nod back. He wasn't ready for that, and he wasn't going to pretend to be. But he held the gaze without flinching, which was its own kind of statement. Outside the chamber, in the ministry corridor, The four of them were reassembling themselves when a door opened behind them and Snape came through it. Harry blinked. He hadn't known Snape was in the chamber. But then Snape moved like he wanted not to be noticed, and Harry had been focused elsewhere. Snape looked at Harry with an expression that was difficult and private and very different from his classroom manner. He stopped a few feet away, as if physical distance was something he needed. "The St. Mungo's consultation," Snape said without preamble. "I didn't know about it. I want you to understand that." He seemed to be deciding, in real time, what he was going to say next. "I knew about the placement. I knew you were with Muggles, and I had concerns, and I did not act on them, because I trusted Dumbledore's authority in ways I was in the habit of not questioning." His voice was very flat. "I was wrong to not question it. That is what I am telling you." Harry looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" Harry said. "Because—" Snape stopped. Started again. "Because I knew your mother. And whatever I thought about your father, Lily Evans was someone whose child should have been better protected. And I failed that. As did everyone." His jaw was tight. "I am telling you because it is accurate, not because I require absolution." "Good," Harry said. "Because I'm not in the business of providing it." Something moved in Snape's face, not quite surprise, not quite appreciation, something in between. He nodded once, the same kind of nod Dumbledore had given from across the chamber, different in everything except the acknowledgement of something real. "Your potions work," Snape said, as he was turning away. "Continues to be above acceptable." He left. Ron stared at the space where he'd been. Did Snape just apologize to you?" "Sort of," Harry said. "That might be more remarkable than the Wizengamot ruling," Ron said. "Different category of remarkable," Hermione said, still watching the corridor thoughtfully. Amelia found him before they left. She came down the corridor with the energy of someone who has just finished a very long thing and is still processing what it feels like to have finished it. She stopped in front of Harry and seemed to take stock of him, checking, in the way she'd developed as a habit, whether he was all right in the specific and literal sense rather than the polite one. "How are you?" she said. "The ruling should have included Azkaban," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "It should have. But it didn't because that's how it works." "That's how it works," she agreed. "I won't pretend otherwise." She paused. "What it did do, the financial penalties, the position removals, the permanent bar from the Wizengamot, those things are real. The record is real. And the Board of Governors' review recommendation is real, which means his tenure at Hogwarts is now genuinely uncertain." "Is McGonagall next in line?" Harry asked. "For headmistress? If the board votes to remove him, she's the most logical appointment." Amelia looked at him steadily. "Would that be all right with you?" "Yes," Harry said without hesitation. "Then, I want to talk to you about something else." She waited. "Quirrell," he said, and watched her expression change in real time. "Not much, but enough. You know something about him." "Harry, you do," he said. Not accusatory. Just stating what he could read in her face. "Something's being guarded in Hogwarts. I know about the dog on the 3rd floor. I know there's something under the trapdoor it's guarding. And I know that Quirrell is carrying something in that turban that requires a dark containment solution, which suggests he's already a vector for whatever it is I'm going to eventually have to deal with." He held her gaze. "Tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. "The Philosopher's Stone," she said. "Nicholas Flamel's stone. It was moved from Gringotts to Hogwarts in July, on Dumbledore's authority, because he believed it was a target for—" She paused. "For Voldemort, or what remains of him. He believed Hogwarts was the safest location." She paused. "He may have been right about that, while being wrong about everything else." "Quirrell," Harry said, "is being investigated," she said. "Covertly. We have enough to suspect but not yet enough to act. The moment we move openly, if our suspicion about what he's hosting is correct, the situation could escalate in ways that are very difficult to manage in an enclosed space full of children. So you're waiting for him to make a move? Harry said. Yes. And when he does? She looked at him with the full weight of someone who has decided to be honest with a person who has consistently proven they can handle honesty. If he goes for the stone, which is under 6 layers of magical protection in the vaults beneath the school, we'll have Aurors in position to intercept. She paused. It should not reach Harry Potter. That is my position, and I have staked professional authority on it. But Voldemort isn't a normal enemy, Harry said. And Quirrell isn't a normal vessel. No, she said. And your Aurors won't be able to do what I might be able to do. Harry, I'm not saying I want to fight him, Harry said. I'm saying I want to know the plan. All of it. So that if the plan fails, I'm not standing in a corridor without information. He looked at her. You've been honest with me about everything else. Be honest about this. She was quiet for a moment. If the perimeter fails, she said, if Quirrell gets through the protections, the final safeguard is a mirror. The mirror of East. It will only give the stone to someone who wants to find it but not use it. She looked at him. Dumbledore placed it. I would have placed you instead, if I'd had the authority when the plan was made. Harry thought about this. That's a good design, he said. For normal people. Quirrell isn't trying to get the stone for himself, Amelia said quietly. No, Harry said. He's not. He thought about the back of the classroom that Quirrell never looked at. About the smell that Neville's grandmother had identified without needing to see it. He's not trying to use it. He's trying to give it to someone else. Who also doesn't want to use it, Amelia said. Who wants to become it? Who wants what the stone produces? Immortality, Harry said. He's already survived death once. He wants to not have to survive it again. She nodded. Harry thought about the mirror and the desire, and the thing that had sustained him for 11 years when there was nothing else, not hope, exactly, not love, just the stubbornness of someone who had never been given anything and had therefore never learned to want things he couldn't earn. He thought about what it meant to look in a mirror that showed you your heart's desire. He'll get through the protections, Harry said. Not because they're inadequate. Because he's been in that school all year learning their positions and Voldemort has been in his head helping him plan it. Amelia's expression confirmed this. When? Harry asked. We don't know yet, she said. Which is why I need you to. I'll tell you when, Harry said. When I know. She looked at him. Quirrell avoids looking at me, Harry said. Not the back of the room. Me specifically. I tested it last week. I moved seats and his avoidance moved with me. Which means whatever is in that turban is aware of me specifically. Which means it knows something about the connection between us. He paused. When he's ready to make his move, he won't be able to not look at me first. That's my best read. Watch for the moment he looks at me directly. Amelia Bones stared at him for a long moment. You're 11 years old, she said, not for the first time. Apparently, he said, for the second time. She almost smiled. Then she said very seriously, when you know, you come to me. Not to the 3rd floor corridor, not to the trapdoor, not down any stairs with Ron and Hermione and a brilliant justification. To me first. I can't promise that, Harry said honestly. If it happens in the middle of the night with no time, then you wake me, she said. My Patronus is a lynx. If you can produce a Patronus, not yet, Harry said. But give me a week. She stared at him. Hermione's been helping me work on the Patronus theory, Harry said, with the air of someone reporting ordinary progress. The emotional recall component it's been challenging, finding a strong enough memory. Most of mine are about surviving rather than joy. He paused. But Ron's mum's Christmas invitation. I think that might be it. Amelia Bones looked at Harry Potter in the ministry corridor, 11 years old, with a blackthorn wand in his pocket, and 4 pages of Hermione's briefing notes, folded in his hand, and the full weight of what had just happened in that chamber sitting on him in some way that he wasn't going to show her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a professional context in a very long time. Not pity. Not the institutional version of concern. Something more personal. Something that was about who this specific person was, rather than what he represented. 1 week, she said. And Harry, whatever happens next, whatever comes through that corridor or down those stairs, you are not alone in it. You understand me? I understand, he said. And he meant it, which was the thing that mattered, because he'd understood the words before but not meant them, not believed them, not in the bone-deep way that made the words real rather than just a kind construction. He meant it now. He went to find Ron and Hermione and Neville. That evening, back at Hogwarts, he sat in the Gryffindor common room after the others had gone to bed and worked on the Patronus charm for an hour. The spell was advanced, far beyond first year, beyond most of what he was technically supposed to be attempting, but the theory was available in the library and the mechanics weren't beyond him, and the emotional recall was the hardest part, which was a component that was entirely independent of technical training. He sat in the quiet of the empty common room with the blackthorn wand and thought about the carriage that morning, 4 of them crowded in, Hermione's briefing notes, Ron's terrible attempt at subtlety when waving, Neville standing at the carriage with his bag and his quietly resolved expression. He thought about Mrs. Weasley's postscript. The room is always there. He raised his wand and spoke the incantation clearly, with the full weight of what the memory meant, and the charm that came from the tip of the wand was not mist, not fog, not the faint shimmer of a first attempt. It was light. A corporeal form, fully formed, silver and sure and moving through the air of the common room like something that had been waiting to exist, a stag, because of course it was, because some things were written at a deeper level than choice. It walked the length of the room and turned and looked at him with the particular quality of something that was made of his best self and knew it. He lowered his wand. The stag dissolved, but the light lingered a moment, the way afterimages did. He sat in it. Then he went to bed, because tomorrow Quirrell had looked at him, once, quickly, in the corridor after dinner, and it was the first time. The clock had started. Chapter 6. What We Build in the Dark. Harry woke at 2 in the morning knowing something was wrong. Not the slow surfacing of a bad dream, something sharper, a pressure behind his scar that he'd felt once before, briefly, in Quirrell's first defense lesson, and had filed away without fully understanding what it meant. He lay still for 3 seconds, cataloging. The dormitory was quiet, 5 other first-year boys breathing in various rhythms, the castle settling around them with its old stone voice. The pressure built, and then eased, and then built again, rhythmic and purposeful, like something knocking at a door from the other side. He sat up. The scar had been quiet all year except in Quirrell's presence, a detail he'd noted and cross-referenced with everything else and arrived at a conclusion about that he'd shared with Amelia and Hermione separately and gotten confirmation from both directions. Now it was active at 2 in the morning, which meant Quirrell was active at 2 in the morning, which meant he had his wand in hand and was pulling on his trainers before the thought completed itself. He crossed to Ron's bed and shook his shoulder. Ron came awake the way people did when they'd grown up in a house full of older brothers, instantly, without confusion, with the immediate practical question of what rather than the foggy where am I of comfortable sleepers. It's starting, Harry said quietly. Ron sat up. Now? Now. Ron reached for his wand. Harry crossed to Neville's bed next, because Neville had proven in the last 3 weeks to be someone he wanted on his side in situations that required both calm and specific knowledge, and the look on Neville's face when Harry told him was the same as it had been at the carriage, resolved, in his quiet way, without drama. I'm coming, Neville said. I know, Harry said. Hermione's dormitory was up the girls' staircase, and the staircase did something architectural and opinionated when Harry set foot on it, shifting under his weight in the way of something with both opinions and mechanisms for enforcing them. He stepped back, thought for half a second, then sent his Patronus up instead. The stag moved up the stairs without difficulty, because a Patronus was light and intention and the staircase had no jurisdiction over either, and 2 minutes later Hermione appeared at the top in her dressing gown with her wand, her expression, and a small bag of things she'd apparently assembled in advance. Harry looked at the bag. "I packed it Tuesday," she said without embarrassment. "After what you said about watching Quirrell." "What's in it?" "Didn't he?" "A bezoar. Lumos charged glow stones. A copy of the protection scheme layout I reconstructed from library records." She came down the stairs. "And biscuits, because Ron." "Thank you," Ron said from behind Harry entirely sincerely. They went down to the common room. Harry stopped at the portrait hole. "Here's what we're doing," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "We go to the 3rd floor. Not through the trapdoor, not yet. I send Amelia's signal first, from outside the corridor, and we wait 2 minutes. If she responds, we hold position and let the Aurors handle it." "And if she doesn't respond?" Neville asked. "Then we assess what's happening and make a decision based on that," Harry said. "Not before. We don't go charging in because we think we know what's down there. We look first, then decide." This was not, Harry was aware, the instruction Amelia had given him, which had been simpler and more absolute. But Amelia's instruction had been predicated on having time to reach her, and 2 in the morning with Quirrell already inside the protections was not that situation. He wasn't being reckless. He was being precise. "Right," Hermione said. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she approved of something and also had concerns about it. "Right." They went out through the portrait hole into the dark corridor. The castle at night was different from the castle in the day in the way that large old things were always different when the activity that usually animated them was stripped away, quieter and somehow larger, the magic in the walls more present without the noise of 400 students moving through it. Harry moved through it the way he'd learned to move through the Dursleys' house at night, light on his feet, aware of every surface, mapping the silence for variations. The 3rd floor corridor was locked in the ordinary way and Harry had the spell for it, which he practiced twice in the library for exactly this reason, and the door swung open and they went through into the room with the 3-headed dog, which was asleep. This was unexpected and also, given what it meant, deeply expected. The dog, enormous, impossibly enormous, all 3 heads drooping with the particular bonelessness of something under a powerful charm, was breathing in slow unified rhythm over the trapdoor, which was open. Open. Harry crouched at the edge and looked down into the dark below. He felt the scar pressure again, stronger now, a pulse behind his eye that was directional, downward, ahead, further in. He raised his wand, held the Patronus spell ready at the edge of intention, and sent the signal instead. The silver stag moved through the wall. They waited. 1 minute. 2. "She'll be coming," Hermione said, with certainty. "Yes," Harry said. "But he's already through the dog, which means he's had the whole night to get through whatever else is down there, and I don't know how long the countermeasures take to breach." He looked at the open trapdoor. "How many protections did you reconstruct?" 6, Hermione said. "Devil's snare, a key chamber, a chessboard, a troll, already neutralized by the smell. They used a preemptive knockout charm, that's standard, a logic puzzle with potions, and the mirror." "The mirror is last." "Yes." "The logic puzzle before it, you've seen the structure?" "I solved it last week," she said in the matter-of-fact way of someone who considers this obvious. "It's not difficult if you eliminate the fear variable." Harry looked at his friends. He looked at the open trapdoor. He thought about Amelia's instruction and also about the healer's report, and the ward transcripts and the piece of parchment that had started all of this, and he thought about the fact that everything that had happened this year, the legal proceedings, the Wiesengemot, the ruling, all of it, would mean nothing if the thing at the bottom of those stairs succeeded tonight, because you could not build a future on a foundation that Voldemort had burned. "We go down," he said. "Amelia's coming. We slow him, we hold position, we do not engage directly unless there's no other option." "Clear?" "Clear," said Ron. "Clear," said Neville. "Absolutely not clear," said Hermione. "But I'm coming anyway." Which was the most honest thing she'd said all year. Harry dropped through the trapdoor. The fall was long enough to matter and short enough to manage, and the thing that caught them was soft and cool and immediately alarming. Plant matter, alive, coiling. Devil's snare, Hermione said from somewhere in the dark. Don't struggle. It tightens when you, Lumos Maxima, Harry said, and the light that bloomed from the Blackthorn wand was not first-year Lumos, not the careful beginner's light he produced for Ollivander. It was everything, full and direct, and the devil's snare recoiled from it like something that had lived in dark places for so long it had forgotten what light felt like. They dropped through onto solid ground. A corridor ahead. A door, standing open, the key chamber, Hermione had said, and they moved through quickly, Harry feeling the scar pressure building with proximity. The winged keys were still in turbulent motion from Quirrell's passage, several of them damaged, and they went through into the next room. The chessboard was in ruins. Not Quirrell's work. Quirrell wouldn't have done it this way. Quirrell would have used a charm. This was a game played and won, pieces shattered, the board cracked down the middle in the specific way of something that had given everything it had to stop someone from passing and had not been enough. He played through it, Ron said, looking at the destruction with the expression of someone who loved chess and found this personally offensive. He played an entire match down here. In the dark. Against enchanted pieces. Faster than I'd have managed it, Harry said, which was true and worth acknowledging. I could have done it, Ron said, with the distraction of someone running the positions. In about 20 minutes. We don't have 20 minutes, Harry said. Move. The potion chamber was ahead, and Hermione went to the bottles without breaking stride, reading the logic of the arrangement with the particular focus of someone who has already solved this problem once, and is simply re-executing the solution. She identified the correct bottle in 40 seconds, handed one to Harry, kept one for herself. Forward, she said. This one sends you back. She pressed her bottle into Neville's hand. Ron, stay with Neville. Send my Patronus if Madame Bones arrives. She had been practicing her own since Harry produced his, and the Patronus she'd been producing for a week was a small, bright otter that moved with tremendous self-assurance. I know the Patronus, Neville said. You showed me. You shouldn't have to, Hermione said. I know, Neville said with calm. But if I need to, I can. Harry drank the potion, felt the chill of it, not cold exactly, more like the sensation of stepping through the membrane of one room into another, and he and Hermione stepped through the final door. The room beyond was circular, and dominated entirely by the mirror. The mirror of Eris stood in the center of the space with the presence of something that knew what it was, tall, ornate, the inscription along the top that Harry had read about in Hermione's notes running in gold letters through the carved frame. Quirrell stood before it, his back to the door, his posture rigid with effort. Harry stopped. He assessed the room in the 2 seconds Quirrell didn't yet know he was there. The mirror, Quirrell before it, the set of Quirrell's shoulders, and the smell, stronger here, much stronger, the containment solution scent that Neville had identified, wrong and heavy in the air. Quirrell was trying to read the mirror's reflection. He was failing. His hands were up, both palms extended toward the glass, and whatever magic he was pushing at it was not working, and the not working was making something in the room agitated in a way that the smell described better than any visual evidence. The mirror was doing its job. Harry felt the scar flare sharp and immediate, like a brand, and Quirrell spun around. His face when he turned was wrong, in the specific way that a face was wrong when there was something else behind it, when the expression was not the person's but was being made by one person and driven by another. His eyes were too intent, the nervous manner entirely gone, replaced by something that moved in Quirrell's face like a current moving under ice. Harry Potter, Quirrell said, and his voice was layered. Underneath the stutter and the taut academic nervousness was something older and colder, half there but gathering. I was wondering when you'd arrive. I was wondering when you'd make your move, Harry said. Quirrell's eyes did something that was not surprise but was the calculation of someone adjusting a plan. You knew. Since the first defense lesson, Harry said. You wouldn't look at the back of the room. And then I tested it by moving seats. A pause. The something behind Quirrell was paying attention, and the attention felt like cold water in the room. You've been busy, Quirrell said in the doubled voice. The legal proceedings. Dumbledore. Quite the autumn for someone your age. It's been a full term, Harry agreed. He kept his voice even and his wand at his side, not raised, not lowered, available. You should know that Amelia Bones is coming. Aurors are on their way through the protections right now. He paused. So whatever you're planning to do at that mirror, you've run out of time to do it. Quirrell's smile was not his own. The mirror won't give me the stone, he said. I've tried. Because you want to use it, Harry said. Someone who wants to use it can't get it. Yes, said the doubled voice. And then, with something that was not warmth but was doing an impression of it. You, on the other hand? What would you see, I wonder, if you looked in it? Not the stone, Harry said. Are you certain? The cold in the room deepened. A child who has spent 11 years being told he deserves nothing, who has been given nothing, who is suddenly facing the future your little prophecy describes. What does such a child see when he looks in the mirror that shows him what he most desires? Harry thought about this question the way he thought about all important questions, not reflexively, actually considering it, because considering it was more useful than dismissing it. I see what I've already built, he said. The last 3 months. The people in this school. Amelia. The legal record. The things that are real. He looked at Quirrell steadily. Not what I want but haven't got. What I already have. Something flickered in Quirrell's expression, in the something behind Quirrell's expression, the older, colder thing that was reading Harry with an attention that was not like human attention. You've changed, the doubled voice said, and it was almost curious. I have been watching, through this vessel, watching you this year. The child I expected. The one Dumbledore made. He didn't make me, Harry said. He tried to diminish me. Those aren't the same thing. Semantics. No, Harry said. It's the whole point. He felt the scar again, harder, and Quirrell moved, not toward the mirror but toward Harry, arms extending with a spell building in his hands. And Harry raised the blackthorn wand and cast without deliberation, the way you did when you'd spent months learning to trust that your magic knew what you meant. The shield that bloomed from the wand was not a first-year shield. He didn't know what it was, technically. It was not a named charm he'd consciously learned. It was something his core had assembled from the components available to it. Light and intention and 11 years of magic with nowhere to go suddenly given the room it had always needed. It met Quirrell's hex and didn't deflect it, didn't block it, absorbed it, the light of it, drinking it in like something thirsty. Quirrell stopped. The cold in the room contracted. Interesting, said the voice that was not Quirrell's. I know, Harry said. Quirrell tried again, something darker this time, the color of it wrong in the air, and Harry didn't shield. He moved, using the space the way someone did when they'd grown up learning that standing still in a hostile environment was a choice you made only when you had nowhere to move. He was around the hex and moving toward the mirror and Quirrell had to turn, losing his line, and that was the moment. Harry stopped in front of the mirror of Arist. He looked into it. He had told Quirrell what he expected to see, and he had told the truth as he'd understood it, but the mirror did not care about expectations. It showed you what your heart desired most, what you wanted in the deepest operational layer of yourself beneath the conscious mind, beneath the things you decided to want since you started thinking carefully about wanting. He saw himself. Older, not much, 17, maybe 18, standing in the image like he was standing here, and beside him a woman with red hair and green eyes and the expression of someone who laughed easily and often, and beside her a man with dark messy hair and glasses and the slightly guilty smile of someone who knows he should probably have cleaned the kitchen. He saw his parents alive. He stood with that for a long moment. The mirror showed the stone in his reflection's hand, the reflection reaching into its pocket, and finding it, the way it appeared to people who wanted to find the stone but not use it. But the stone was almost peripheral to what was actually in the mirror and to what it showed him about the deepest operational layer of himself. He did not reach for the stone. He stood and looked at his parents and breathed. "What do you see?" Quirrell said behind him, and the doubled voice was strained with something. Harry turned away from the mirror and felt something in his chest settle, the way a wound settled when it was being properly treated rather than suppressed. Not healed, not yet, but acknowledged, given its correct name, permitted to be what it was. "Nothing useful to you," he said. He felt the stone in his pocket. He didn't look down. He didn't reach for it. He'd felt it arrive, the mirrors working, felt it appear in his pocket as his reflection had shown it appearing, and he kept his eyes on Quirrell and his face neutral, and the stone sat in his pocket as he said nothing about it. The cold in the room was gathering differently now, not the diffuse cold of presence but something more concentrated, something coming to a decision. "The boy is lying," said the not Quirrell voice, quiet and absolutely certain. "He has the stone. I can feel it." Quirrell advanced. Harry held his wand level and thought, clearly and quickly, "Hermione, I need you." Hermione, who had been standing just inside the room's entrance since the mirror confrontation began, having assessed within 10 seconds of arriving that the worst thing she could do was draw Quirrell's attention away from Harry before she understood the shape of what was happening, moved. She cast 3 things in rapid sequence, an immobilis that hit Quirrell in the left shoulder, dropping that arm, a protego totalum that sealed the room from whatever was building outside it, and a containment charm she'd been researching specifically for 2 weeks in response to Neville's grandmother's description, a charm designed for dark magical entities that couldn't survive in open air. The containment charm hit the space around Quirrell, and the doubled voice screamed. Not Quirrell screaming, Quirrell went rigid and silent. The scream was the thing in the turban, the voice that was not his, and it was the sound of something that had survived every other assault on its existence, and had just met something designed to work on it specifically. Harry grabbed Quirrell's arm. The contact was immediate and overwhelming, the same thing Quirrell had been avoiding all year, the same thing the examination had described in Healer Cavendish's notes, the connection between Harry and the thing in the turban that was old magic and specific and moved both directions. Harry felt it move through him like electricity, felt the scar burn, felt the cold recoil from the contact as if burned by it, because it was burned by it, because Lily Potter's sacrifice had done something that was still active in Harry's skin, still operational, still present in the specific way that magic built on love remained present. Quirrell wrenched back, and where Harry's hands had been there was damage, not to Harry, to Quirrell, the skin of his wrist and forearm blistering where the contact had been, the man dropping to his knees with a sound of genuine pain, and the scream from the turban went up an octave. Harry stepped back. He breathed. The turban moved. Slowly, with the quality of something that no longer had the containment to prevent it, the turban unraveled, and what was in the back of Professor Quirinus Quirrell's head was not the face of something that had ruled the wizarding world through terror for a decade. It was barely a face at all, etched into the skin like an old scar given will, a presence rather than a person, eyes that were not eyes but apertures for something looking through. It was Voldemort, and it was diminished, and it was still the most frightening thing Harry had ever seen. It looked at him. "Powerful," it said in a voice that came from somewhere beyond Quirrell, thin and ancient. "So much wasted. Dumbledore wasted so much of you, trying to keep you manageable." Something that might have been a smile crossed the face that wasn't. "We could have used each other well, you and I." "No," Harry said. "The prophecy says either can live while the other survives." "The prophecy says a lot of things," Harry said. "You used it to frame a 50-year war. Dumbledore used it to justify 10 years of abuse. I'm going to use it differently." He looked at the thing on the back of Quirrell's head without flinching. "I'm going to use it to remember that it ends." The face that wasn't contracted. And then the door blew open. Amelia Bones came through it first, which was not how Auror protocol worked. Senior officers were supposed to enter second, after the threat was assessed, but which was exactly how Amelia Bones operated when there was a child in the room ahead. Behind her came Kingsley, and behind him 2 more Aurors, and the room filled with controlled professional energy, and the specific calm of people who trained for exactly this. Quirrell collapsed. Voldemort, what remained of him, the diminished and furious presence, came apart in the air like smoke in a wind, tearing itself from Quirrell's failing body with the scream of something that had survived death before and was going to have to survive it again, not finally, not yet, but again and again, smaller each time, until eventually the surviving itself wore out. It was gone. Quirrell lay on the stone floor, breathing. Kingsley had him secured in 2 seconds with professional efficiency that acknowledged the man was both a criminal and dying, because the leaving of what had been sustaining him was not a survivable injury in the short term, and the Aurors knew this and treated it accordingly, with medical attention and restraints both. Amelia crossed the room to Harry. She looked at him, all of him, head to toe, the fast assessment of someone checking for damage, and then she looked at Hermione, and then she looked at the mirror, and then she looked at Harry again. "The stone," she said. He reached into his pocket and handed it to her. She took it, and her expression did the complicated thing it did when she felt strongly and was deciding how much of it to show. She closed her hand around the stone and looked at him. "You looked in the mirror?" she said. "Yes." "And you got the stone?" "Yes." "What did you see?" He thought about telling her something partial, something that wasn't a lie but left the most private part of it intact. Then he thought about what she'd given him this year. Complete honesty, even when the honesty was hard, even when a softer version would have been kinder, and he decided she'd earn the same. "My parents," he said. "Alive." She was very still. "I didn't reach for the stone," he said. "I just looked at them for a moment. And then I turned around." She looked at him with that expression that wasn't pity and wasn't quite anything else he had a clean name for, and said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Harry." "Don't be," he said. "I know what it means. The mirror showed me that I want that more than I want anything else. Which means I'm going to carry it my whole life, and there's no way around it." He paused. "But I looked at it, and then I turned around. I think that's the most important thing I've ever done." She nodded. A long, slow nod that contained a great deal. "Hermione," Harry said, looking back. Hermione had her arms wrapped around herself in the way she did when she was very full of feeling and was trying to be precise despite it. She walked forward and Harry put his arm around her shoulders because it was the right thing to do and he was done with being measured about that kind of thing, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and breathed, and then straightened up and was Hermione again, which was someone remarkable, always. "The containment charm worked," she said into the middle distance. "Extraordinarily well," he said. "I wasn't certain it would." She looked at him. "I was quite frightened." "I know," he said. "You came through the door anyway." "Obviously," she said. They emerged from the trapdoor into the room with the sleeping dog at 4 a.m, which was lighter than Harry had expected. Torches had appeared along the corridor walls, lit by the castle the way the castle lit things when it decided they needed lighting, which was one of his favorite things about Hogwarts. The castle had opinions and acted on them. Neville and Ron were waiting at the top. Ron saw Harry and Hermione come through and crossed the room in 3 steps and put one hand briefly on Harry's arm and one on Hermione's and said nothing, which was exactly correct. Neville looked at Harry and said, "It's done." "For now," Harry said. He got away. What's left of him? But not with the stone, and not able to use Quirrell anymore. Neville nodded, the same kind of nod he'd been developing all year, not satisfied, but resolved. "For now is enough," he said. "Yeah," Harry said. "It is." Amelia came up through the trapdoor last, the stone in her pocket, and Kingsley behind her with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been doing this since before any of them were born. She looked at all 4 of them, not a group, but 4 specific people she'd come to know in varying degrees over the past months, and said, "Poppy Pomfrey is going to want to see all of you in the morning." "We're fine," Harry said. "I know you are," she said. "I want her to confirm it." He could work with that. The Hogwarts Board of Governors voted to remove Dumbledore as headmaster on the 1st of December. It was not unanimous. 4 members voted against, citing his decades of service and the incomplete state of the full criminal proceedings. But the majority was sufficient, and Minerva McGonagall was appointed acting headmistress pending a formal selection process that everyone understood was a formality. She received the news in her office at 7 in the morning with the expression of someone who had been expecting it, and had prepared for it, and was still, beneath all of that, genuinely moved. Harry heard about it at breakfast, from Ron, who'd gotten a letter from his father. He ate his eggs and thought about it. "How do you feel?" Hermione asked. "Like something is correctly arranged that wasn't before," he said. "Not finished. Not resolved. Just correctly arranged." She nodded, which was her version of complete agreement. Dumbledore did not leave Hogwarts immediately. There were things to transfer, records to hand over, the logistical reality of vacating a position that had been occupied for 30 years. Harry encountered him once in the corridor outside the library, 3 days after the board's decision. Dumbledore stopped. Harry stopped. They looked at each other in the corridor, the tall old man with his magnificent impractical beard and his half-moon glasses and the lifetime of decisions that had brought him here, and the 11-year-old boy with the blackthorn wand in his pocket and a scar on his forehead and 3 months of his own decisions that had brought him somewhere he hadn't expected. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Professor," Harry said. The title was not warmth, but it was not hostility. It was just accuracy. "I want to," Dumbledore began, and stopped, and seemed to actually be struggling, which was unusual enough to be notable. "There are things I owe you that cannot be offered as apology. I am aware of that." "Yes," Harry said. "But I want you to know." Another stop, and the serenity, which had been his defining quality, was entirely absent from his face in this moment. What was there instead was something more interesting and considerably more human. "I want you to know that I did not understand, until this year, the full cost of what I had considered acceptable. I built a theory and I believed in it with the certainty of someone who had been right for a very long time, and I was wrong in a way that I could have examined and chose not to." "I know," Harry said. "I worked that out." Dumbledore looked at him. "May I ask, what will you do with all of this?" Harry considered the question. It was a genuine one, which he could tell by the way it was asked, not strategic, not gathering information for a plan. Just someone who wanted to know. "Finish school," Harry said. "Learn everything I can. Deal with Voldemort when it comes to that, because it will, and I'm not going to pretend it won't." He paused. "On my terms. Not because I was shaped for it. Because I choose it." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "You are very like your mother," he said. "The certainty of it. The way it comes from somewhere you can't fake." Harry felt that land, the way anything about his mother landed, carefully, the way you handled something precious. "I'll take that," he said. Dumbledore nodded. He moved to pass, and Harry stepped aside, and they went their separate ways down the corridor, and that was not an ending to anything. It was not forgiveness or resolution, it was just two people who had been on opposing sides of a decade of harm, moving forward in the same castle without pretending that proximity was absolution. It was the most honest thing that could have happened. The weeks between November and Christmas passed with the texture of things being built properly rather than assembled in crisis. McGonagall remade the headmistress's office in one weekend, which was less about furniture and more about which portraits she spoke to and what she put on the desk and the way the school's magic responded to her occupancy of the position. The castle, which had been paying attention all year, seemed to settle differently with her in the chair, some long-held tension easing in the old stones. Harry felt it, and said so to Hermione, who said she noticed it too and was formulating a hypothesis about magical buildings and the compatibility between their consciousness and the consciousness of their inhabitants. Snape continued to be Snape, which meant he was difficult and brilliant and impossible, and, Harry was coming to understand, engaged in a private reckoning with himself that showed up in small ways. The way he returned Harry's essays with marginalia that were critical and also, increasingly, substantive. The way he hadn't given Gryffindor a single unearned point deduction since November. The way he'd been observed by Ron, sitting in the library at midnight with his own copy of the healer's report from the DMLE investigation, open to the section on long-term magical core suppression. Harry had found out about that from Ron, who had found out from Fred, who had it from Angelina Johnson, who had an entirely legitimate reason for being in the library at midnight that no one had yet successfully explained. He'd thought about it for a long time. Then he'd left a note in Snape's classroom that said only, "The Advanced Core Theory Text, Section 4. Worth the reading." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. 2 days later he found an unmarked piece of parchment on his own desk in Potions that contained a 12-point annotated analysis of Section 4 of Advanced Core Theory, with 3 corrections to the text assumptions and a recommendation for 2 further reading sources. He showed it to Hermione, who read it and said, "This is actually very good." "I know," Harry said. "Are you going to respond?" "Already have," he said, and tapped the reading list she'd made him from the 2 recommended sources, which he'd already started. She shook her head, but she was smiling. The Christmas holidays arrived, and Harry went to the Burrow. Amelia had asked, with the carefulness she deployed around things she felt strongly about, whether he wanted to stay at the Ministry's secure housing or at Hogwarts, both of which were available and comfortable and entirely without the complexity of spending the holiday with a family whose matriarch was in the middle of revising her assessment of someone the family loved. He'd thought about it for a day. Then he told Amelia he was going to the Burrow, and she looked at him with the expression that asked without asking, and he'd said, "Molly Weasley left a room available when things were complicated. That's worth something." Amelia nodded slowly. "It is," she said. "It genuinely is." The Burrow was exactly what it looked like from the outside, improbable and enormous and full of people and noise and the specific warmth of a house that had been loved into its current shape over many years. The clock on the kitchen wall had hands for every family member, all of them pointing to home for the holidays, and there was a small extra hand that Molly Weasley had added while Harry was in transit and that someone had labeled, in careful writing, "Harry," and that was pointing at safe. Harry stood in the kitchen and looked at the clock for a long moment. Molly Weasley was behind him, and she was the kind of person whose emotional states were not internal experiences but whole-body ones, and she had been managing a great deal of feeling about a great deal of things all autumn, and when Harry turned from the clock her expression was the expression of someone who has done a lot of private thinking and arrived somewhere honest. "I was wrong to think he couldn't be," she said without preamble, which was more Weasley than she probably realized. "Wrong not to ask more questions, wrong to trust completely rather than—" She stopped. "Ron told me what you said. That I'm a good person and I trusted Dumbledore." "You are," Harry said. "Good people can still fail someone," she said. "By not asking." "Yes," he said. "They can." She looked at him with the look that he'd seen from the platform in September. The platform at King's Cross where she'd kissed her children goodbye, that warmth that was structural, that wasn't managed or strategic, just there, just her. "I'm asking now," she said. "Are you all right?" Actually. He thought about the mirror. He thought about the stone in his pocket, and turning around. He thought about the stag in the common room, and Amelia's voice saying, "You are not alone in this." "I'm getting there," he said. Genuinely. She nodded, and then she did the thing she did, the thing he'd watched her do on the platform. She pulled him forward and held on, and it was nothing like the Dursleys and nothing like anyone had ever done, and he stood in the kitchen of the Burrow with his arms at his sides for about 3 seconds before he understood what to do with them and put them around her instead. He'd cried once, in the 3 months since platform 9 3/4. Late in the Ministry housing, the night after the first day of testimony, sitting on the edge of the Real bed with his hand flat on the mattress. Not from grief exactly, or from anger, just from the accumulated weight of having a name, finally, for a decade of things that had been wrong, and the specific relief of having that name exist in a legal record somewhere. He didn't cry now. But it was a near thing, and he was not ashamed of that, and the not being ashamed was also new. Ron appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the scene, and retreated with exquisite tact. Harry heard him tell Fred and George in the corridor to stay out of the kitchen for 5 minutes. Fred said, "Why?" And Ron said, "Because I said so." And Fred said that wasn't an explanation, and then Ginny Weasley, who Harry hadn't properly met yet, who had apparently been building toward meeting him all year with a mixture of nerves and determination, said from somewhere down the corridor, "Just give him a minute." And there was a brief silence, and then everyone gave him a minute. January began, and the case continued. The full criminal hearing, the one that addressed the obstruction charge at its most serious level, ran through February and March, with Harry testifying twice more and Amelia presenting the street mungo's consultation as the centerpiece of an intent argument that was, by the end, impossible to dismantle. Dumbledore's final penalty included the 30,000 galleon fine and a formal legislative reform. The Platform 9 3/4 ward alert system was enshrined in law as a mandatory active monitoring protocol, with reports routed directly to the head of the DMLE, permanently and irrevocably, which meant that no future individual could reroute them without a Wisengamot vote. Rita Skeeter had written, over the course of the year, 8 articles in the Prophet. The first 3 had been sympathetic to Dumbledore. The next 5 had not been. What turned her wasn't virtue. Skeeter did not operate primarily on virtue, it was the story. The story had become too big and too well evidenced and too publicly documented to be managed by institutional sympathy, and Skeeter, who had the journalist's instinct for the direction of historical gravity, had followed it. The 8th article ran on March the 1st, and its headline was "The Wards Remember: How One Boy's Worst Year Became the Wizarding World's Reckoning." It was the longest piece the Prophet had run in a decade, and it included, with Harry's permission, obtained through Amelia and accompanied by considerable discussion about framing, a summary of the ward transcript and the healer's report, and what it meant that an 11-year-old had walked through a magical barrier, and the barrier's ancient honesty had said this is wrong in the only language available to it, which was the language of alarm. Harry read it at breakfast in the Great Hall, at the Gryffindor table with Ron on his left and Hermione on his right and Neville across from him, and the Great Hall was full of students reading the same thing, and the quiet it produced was the specific quiet of people absorbing something that was going to change how they thought about a number of things. He put the paper down and ate his toast. "How do you feel?" Hermione asked. Second time she'd asked that in months, in almost the same tone. "Like something is correctly arranged that wasn't before," he said, which was the same answer as last time and was still true. She nodded. Ron said, "Enormous breakfast." "In your honor." "You've been eating enormous breakfasts for months," Harry said. "In your honor," Ron repeated with dignity. Neville pushed the marmalade toward Harry without being asked, which was the kind of thing Neville had been doing for months now, small, specific, accurate acts of care that Harry had learned to receive without deflecting. He took the marmalade and used it. Across the hall, at the staff table, McGonagall was reading the same article with the expression she wore when something was both satisfying and painful simultaneously, which was the expression she wore about this whole year when she thought no one was looking. Snape, beside her, had already folded his copy of the Prophet and put it face down on the table, which was not dismissal but the response of someone who was still working through his own version of what the year meant. At the end of the table, the headmaster's chair, McGonagall's chair now, was occupied, and the portrait of Dumbledore that had appeared on the headmaster's office wall per tradition looked down from the wall it had always occupied, and in the portrait, which was more honest than the man had always been in life, the old face had an expression of something that might have been, finally, genuine. Harry didn't look at the portrait. He had enough to think about that was in front of him. Spring came to Hogwarts the way it always had and always would, as if the castle had decided winter had been sufficient and was ready for something else, and Harry sat on the grass by the lake on an afternoon in April with his charms textbook and the blackthorn wand and the holly wand that he'd retrieved from McGonagall's office and now kept in his bag, not sure yet which hand he was, testing both. Hedwig was in the air somewhere, enjoying the warmth with the self-contained pleasure of an owl who had been through a complicated year and deserved the sun. He was thinking about the prophecy. Not with dread, he made his peace with the fact of it in the way you made peace with weather, by acknowledging that it existed independent of his preference, and planning accordingly. He was thinking about it practically, the way you thought about a long journey, what was required, what the route looked like, what resources he had at his disposal. The resources were considerable. He had a wand that suited him and another that he was learning. He had a magical core that had spent 11 years learning precision, and was now learning range. He had a Patronus that was a stag, fully formed, that he could produce in under 3 seconds from standing. He had Hermione, who was the finest analytical mind he'd ever encountered and who had absolutely no intention of letting him approach Voldemort without a comprehensive research framework. He had Ron, whose strategic thinking was better than his own in certain specific geometries and who would stand next to the fire without being asked. He had Neville, whose knowledge of magical plants was going to be relevant in ways neither of them had fully mapped yet, and whose quiet resolve was the kind you built from the inside rather than inheriting from circumstance. He had Amelia Bones, who had answered a ward alert at 7 in the morning and decided that the child at the other end of it deserved honesty, and had not deviated from that decision once in 9 months. He had a school that remembered what it was built to do, run by a headmistress who intended to let it do it. He had the legal record, indelible, on parchment, in a ministry archive, that said this was done, it was wrong, and the person who did it has been held to account. Not fully, not finally, not in the way that would have felt like justice if justice were a simple transaction, but in the way that was available in the real world, which was the world he lived in and intended to continue living in. He lay back on the grass and looked at the sky. It was an ordinary sky. Blue with the specific quality of April blue, a few clouds with no particular agenda. Hedwig circled somewhere at the edge of his vision, white and purposeful and entirely herself. He thought about what the hat had said. A room full of people who choose to stand next to the fire instead of stepping back from it. He thought about what he'd said to the mirror of Ariste, by understanding what the stone appeared in the pocket of people who wanted to find it but not use it, that he wanted what he'd already built. That the most powerful desire available to him, in the deep layer below the conscious mind, was not for power or revenge, or the impossible restoration of what had been taken from him, but for the specific and concrete reality of the people he'd found and the life he was building in the ruins of what someone else had tried to make him. The mirror had seen that. And he had turned around. He sat up, and he picked up the charms textbook, and he found his page, and he worked on the spell in the afternoon sunshine with the particular focus of someone who was not finished, who had no intention of being finished, who understood that the work was ongoing and that ongoing work was not a burden but a function, the thing that told you that you were alive and choosing and building rather than surviving and waiting and being shaped. He cast the spell. It worked. He made a note on a bit of parchment, and moved to the next one. Somewhere up the hill, the castle looked out over its grounds with the old attentive patience of something that had watched generations of young people discover what they were made of, and the afternoon light was long and gold, and the wards in its walls were doing what they'd always been built to do, watching, clear-eyed and uncorruptible, waiting to say, "This child is safe. This child is seen. This child is known." And for the first time in 11 years, the answer was yes.